Petroff's defence is characterised by the following moves. White plays 1 e4, black plays e5, knight f3, and now knight f6, creating an immediate counter-attack against the e4 pawn. The Petroff is a very solid defence and forces white to fight hard for the initiative. It's especially appropriate when one is facing a dangerous attacking player, and it is used at all levels, although perhaps not quite as commonly as it might be at club level, where I think the Petroff could well provide lively counterplay for black. It's my perception that the average player doesn't really know the Petroff from the white side as well as he or she does if one plays the Italian game, for instance, or the Rai Lopez. It's not at all easy for white to get any sort of advantage at all against the Petroff, and this is why it's seen at Grandmaster level so often, right up to World Championship level, where it becomes almost a staple diet of black players when they want to keep white out. It's a workhorse of many of the world's top players, and it can work for you too. The Petroff is relatively easy to understand. It's an opening, firstly and foremostly, of simple development. Black should try to, in the style of the open game, keep pace with white in terms of development. If white doesn't recognise that black is able to do this, then white can well fall into difficulties. If white gets overambitious, then he can come into real difficulty, as we will see in the upcoming game, which is a game from China played in 2007 between Ivan Cheparinov and the Chinese Grandmaster Wang Yui. And it's my first introductory game. It will show conclusively that overambitious play against the Petroff runs aground, because black's play is so logical. And I think this is an easy game to understand too, despite the fact that it is being played at a very high level tournament. So Cheparinov was graded 2-6-5-7 in this game, and he simply took on e5. Black plays d6, nudging the knight back to f3, and now Wang Yui takes on e4. This is regarded as one of two main lines. White can also play 3d4. We'll tackle the knight takes e5 line first, and against this move I'm recommending black to keep it simple with d5, basically freeing up his pieces, and after bishop d3, bishop e7. There are plenty of other moves for black in this position. He can play bishop d6, he can play knight c6, but bishop e7 is a very reliable way to play and has been used by many of the world's top players. It's a very, very solid move, and white struggles to get any advantage at all against it. And as we'll see here, if he starts to try to pick up the pace a little bit too early, he runs foul of black's simple piece play. So Wang Yui just gets his pieces out. Now what could be easier than that? Knight c6. And white's next move is a sign that he's feeling a little bit impatient. He plays knight c3. We'll see a little later on that white could probably do better than this, and knight c3 is a little bit overambitious in this given position. Wang Yui keeps it simple. He takes on c3 and then moves his bishop out to g4. So active piece placements in the Petroff are the order of the day wherever possible, and you can't get more active than this for black's queen's bishop. Very often in the open game, black has problems developing his queenside. Not so in the Petroff, where quite often black can develop his queenside very easily by first of all moving the light square bishop out to either f5 or g4. Well, Cheparinov now activates his rooks. Black answers rook e1 with the simple castles, and rook b1 with rook b8. I suppose he could have gone b6, but that will involve a slight concession. There's no need for black to make concessions at this stage. Instead, Wang Yui keeps it very sensible. He gives his king a bolt hole. He takes away any possibilities of an attack against h7 or any sacrificial play there, and he just continues to manoeuvre with, well, what I think is ease. Now, Cheparinov goes h3, bishop h5, not fearing the move g4, obviously. If g4, white wants to play g4 in this position, then by all means let him do it. The bishop comes back to g6. If white takes on g6, he only leaves himself with problems on the f-file. So, this is really no good. Cheparinov plays rook e3. Okay, protecting his knight, freeing up the queen. And black just plays bishop d6. Basically, black is, again, keeping it simple He's happy with exchanges here because he understands his pawn structure is better. Endgames should favour him. Well, queen came to e2, and now Wang Yui picks up the pace with the interesting move f5. That's a real tempter. Black is gaining some space himself on the king side. He's preparing now to perhaps challenge white on the e file, and who knows, he may even be threatening to gain further space with f4. Cheparinov comes in with rook e6. He is tempted, and now Wang Yui reveals the point of his idea. He's taking on f3. If white takes on d6, black takes on e2 and ends up with by far the superior position. So Cheparinov's down to g takes f3, when yes, he is certainly in control of the e file, but just look at his pawn structure. Dreadful pawns, double pawns, two sets of double pawns and two isolated pawns. So it's really a question of whether white's active play compensates him for all these weaknesses. It's Wang Yui's job to show that it doesn't. And the way he does this is by carefully consolidating. All he is interested in over the next few moves is defence. He puts his knight on d8. White goes rook e5. No doubt thinking, I'm getting back into the game here. But then knight f7 is an excellent move. And the point of this is to bring the knight to d6. Now it's the white king that's going to feel the heat. White goes rook h5. Well, he can't defend all his pawns. This is the problem. He can obviously take on d5 in this position, but then rook takes f3 is starting to look very dangerous, with h3 on pre and rook b f8 the plan. Cheparinov in general is a very active player, so he tries to keep his rook active by going rook h5, and after rook takes f3 he played king h1, and the point of this is to swing the other rook across to g1. Well, black coordinated his rooks, and after rook g1 he went rook 8 to f4. This is again a very interesting counter-attacking move. White went queen to e2. Of course, the first point of it is that if white goes rook takes h6 in this position, black now has rook takes f2, and this is starting to look very, very dangerous for white. So queen e2 was played. Knight e4. Again, black is happy to liquidate. It's a little bit surprising. And after queen c4 check, of course he can afford to do this because his king is much more secure than white's. Queen e6, and now, believe it or not, black is easily defending himself with queen f8. Cheparinov moved in with queen g6 check, king h8, and then he went rook e5 with the idea of rook e8. Just dropping back, it's hard to see decent alternatives. The sacrifice on h6 isn't working. Black's going to chomp on f2, given half a chance, and then his e-pawn is just threatening to run all the way down the board. So white's got to try to do something active, but the Petroff solid position stands him in good stead all the way through as he plays rook takes h3 check, king g2, rook takes c3, and now rook f1 was the move. Obviously white can play rook e8 in this position. Then comes rook takes f2 check, and this is a total catastrophe for white. He's got to go king h1, and then black has the beautiful rook h3 mate. A precise point perhaps Cheparinov overlooked when he went in for this combination. So rook f1 protecting f2, rook c6 attacking the queen, queen h5, and now king h7, after which Cheparinov resigned. Rook g6 check comes next, and the white king will be dismembered. So in many ways a typical Petroff game. White tried very hard to breach black's defences, but by deploying his pieces actively throughout the game, Wang Yui was able to repel all threats and launch a dangerous counterattack of his own. It's this very solid nature of black's position that attracts a lot of strong players, and the counterattacking nature of the Petroff was certainly revealed in this game. Well, we're going to start off with the business end of the Petroff, the line which is most commonly played at the highest level, and this is knight takes e5. We saw in the opening game black should play d6, And now the main line goes knight takes e4, d4, and now d5 by black. Bishop d3, and we can play knight c6 first and then go bishop e7, or play bishop e7 first. It doesn't matter, it comes to the same. In any case, the most dangerous threat to black's position really occurs when white plays c4. This is a move which tries to undermine black's control of the centre. In particular, now that black can't reinforce his pawn at d5 by playing c6, it makes sense for white to try and chip away with c4. And this is most commonly played at the highest level of chess. So we turn our attention now to the game Michael Adams, English Grandmaster, versus Jan Smeets, Dutch Grandmaster. And this game was played in the Staunton Memorial Tournament in London in August 2009, where black plays knight b4. This is the main line, inviting white to surrender his light squared bishop. There are two lines for white, and the first line we're going to look at is c takes d5. Alright, well against this, black should certainly take the white bishop off and then go queen takes d5. Okay, now white plays rook e1 generally, and black brings his bishop out to f5. And the first point to be made about this position is really that if black is allowed to complete his development in peace, then only black can be better in this position. With two nice bishops, in particular the light squared bishop, has tremendous prospects. So white's got to act in this position at once. And there are three ways to do this. He can bring his knight out to c3, or he can, as Adams plays in this game, go knight e5, and there's also the very sharp move g4, which we're going to look at next. Knight e5 is a very interesting move. It introduces complications. Knight e5 interrupts the communication between the black queen and the bishop f5. And now white is setting up ideas of knight to c3. So black must act immediately, and this Smeets does by castling on the queen side. Now the first point of this move is that if white goes knight c3 here, he falls straight into a trap. Queen takes e5. So Adams, going back to castles, sticks with the recommendation of the theory books and goes queen f3. And Smeets plays g6. Now we get a very complicated forcing sequence here after g4, which leads to most unclear play. Bishop b4. Well, now Mickey Adams, what can we say about him? Fantastic player, tremendous instinct for chess, but even he can go wrong in a wild position like this. I think that was Smeets' intention, to set up a really complicated situation where either side could falter at any move. And well, this is a very random position, of course. Now Adams goes rook e2. I mean, I don't know whether he would have been better off playing rook e3 in this position. That looks like a slightly more secure location for the rook. I'm pretty sure against that Smeets would probably have gone queen takes d4 here, and this is really messy, with lots of pieces on pre. Black's threatening the knight on e5. He's also threatening queen d1 check. It really is a complete mess. So Adams went rook e2, and then came a really fascinating combination here. Bishop takes g4, so that if queen takes g4 check, we have f5. If knight takes g4, as was played in the game, amazingly, Smeets went knight c3. And this is a very interesting move, setting up a fork. Actually, it's a very strange fork. Two white pieces are attacked here, and he can't save both of them. Adams went queen takes d5. Well, going back, I mean, what else is there to play here? Obviously, if he goes rook to e3 in this position, then black can take on f3 and go knight e2 check. This is obviously going to be incredibly unclear, but you know, you can't help but feel that black will emerge on top. So queen takes d5 was played in the game, and now black gets the chance to interject Zwischenzug. Knight takes e2 check. He takes on d5. King takes e2. And now after rook takes d4, we get a very unbalanced position where white has two pieces for rook and two pawns, but he hasn't got any development. So my basic assessment of this position is white is struggling, and black is able to get active very quickly here with rook h4 and bishop d6, eyeing up the weakness on h2. Bishop e3 was played, bishop takes h2, another one bites the dust, and now, okay, Adams has got his pieces out, but at what cost? Smeets now has 3 pawns and a rook for the 2 pieces. It's really hard to see white surviving this one. But it's not quite resignable, and Adams tries to get his pieces coordinated with king to f3 and then king to g2. Black, for his part, must find a good way to push his only passed pawn, surprisingly, the pawn on h7. I think once that pawn gets going, white's going to be in very serious trouble. There's a little bit of work to do consolidating though. So black settles for activating his rooks to the maximum and getting his king into the game slowly via king d7. Note he's putting all his pieces on light squares, keeping out of the range of the bishop on e3. Adams must march around, just trying to gain a little bit of time, but here are the first signs that he's going to lose, and he's going to lose slowly and horribly as the black pawn armada starts to come forward. White is still struggling to activate rook d4, offering exchanges. Of course, the exchange of rooks would only favour black. Knight comes to b2. There's really nothing that that white can do. Black brings his king across to assist in the advance of the kingside pawns. These are black's main trump, really. That's what he wants to organise. It takes a while, but the process is entirely manageable. Well, the time control has been reached. Rook h8, f4, king e6. Black's king comes up to the lovely square f5. It was inexorable. Black was going to create a second passed pawn, and that's exactly what happens. Rook d5 check. King e6. King e4. Well, again, this is looking pretty horrible now. It's not clear to me what white should do. If he goes rook takes g5, which looks like it might be an option, rook takes g5, bishop takes g5, and now I think king f5 is simplest, when white's knight is looking very remote indeed, and the blockade with the bishop is only temporary. Black goes rook g8 and will certainly be able to eject the bishop from h4, after which the pawn advances. So going back to king e6, king e4 was played, h4, and Adams decided to resign this position. This was a very unclear game all the way through. Perhaps it's worthwhile taking a look at the complications again after knight e5 castles, queen f3, g6 on your own to satisfy yourself that black is okay. Essentially, but the main point is black has very good development in this position, and normal play by white will not suffice. Black's 2 bishops and easy development will certainly stand him in good stead. If white doesn't know everything about this position, he's going to basically lose very quickly. You have an extremely nice game. So white had to force the pace, and now Smeets bishop b4 just seemed to create complications where black was perfectly okay. So if Mickey Adams is going to flounder in the complications, so are your opponents. The next game I want to show you is quite interesting. It comes from the Melody Amber tournament played in Monaco in March 2009 between Timur Radjabov playing white and Vladimir Kramnik playing black. And I have to say at this point that Kramnik has been using the Petroff very successfully at the highest levels of world chess for many years now. And you know, again we see him employing our favourite variation with the development of the bishop to e7 and the knight to c6, and white moving in with c4. Alright, well we know what to do against that knight b4, and we get another example of the main line, where black removes the light square bishop. In return, white gets certain chances against black's position because his king's still in the middle, but well, now we reach the critical point, where white has got to force the pace. We saw an example of knight e5 in the last game. Now Radjabov essays Anand's idea here, g4 against Kramnik, and this is going to lead to a very sharp situation. The main aim of this move is to stop black castling by preventing the retreat of the bishop to e6, which would cover the e file. Black has to play bishop g6 in this position, and now white wants to go knight c3. Well, knight takes c3 is by far the main line, queen takes c3, and now black is slightly compromised perhaps, or it looks as though it is, like that, due to the attack on c7. Well, Kramnik employs the best move now, and that's f6, preparing to bring the king to f7 at the cost of the c7 pawn. Now, what's interesting about this game is that Radjabov doesn't take the c7 pawn straight away, preferring to go bishop f4. If he takes on c7, we now take a look at the very interesting game Anand versus Ivan Sokolov, played in Dortmund all the way back in 1999, to show how black should play against this. And it turns out that the looseness of the white king position is the factor which gives black adequate counterplay here. Anand was even able to take on g7 against Sokolov, but after king h8, now it's a question of what white should do next. His king position is most insecure, and the opposite colour bishops tend to favour the attacker. In this case, I think black, who threatens bishop e4. So white must move in with forcing play, and he goes bishop h6, threatening rook takes h7 check, followed by queen g7 mate. So black, for his part, has to continue with forcing play, queen takes g4 check, and this in turn obliges Anand to go queen g3. Then comes queen takes d4, an excellent move, and Anand settled for equality after rook takes g6, h takes g6, queen h3, and now king g8. The game burned out after bishop takes f8, rook takes f8, queen b3 check, rook f7, rook d1, and now queen g4 check, leading to a draw in 31 moves. Just going back to the position after f6 then, in our game, black is going king f7. Well, bishop f4 invited him to play king f7, and that's exactly what Kramnik did. Seems to me that white is trying to find the best possible moment to play queen takes c7. Radjabov delayed it one more move by going h4. Clearly queen takes c7 is possible here as well. After that, I think rook he8 is probably the best move, and if rook e3 here, we have bishop e4, which interrupts white's action on the e file and threatens rook ac8. Going back to rook he8, if white goes knight d2 here, then I think rook a d8, rook a c1, rook d7, queen c4, queen takes c4, rook takes c4, and now bishop d3 gives black very good compensation for his pawn. White has isolated pawns, black's got two nice bishops, and chances of an attack against d4. Not many people have gone this way with white. So that's why Radjabov plays h4, Kramnik goes h5, and only now does he take on c7. This is state-of-the-art stuff. Well, Kramnik played rook he8, and now came more tactical complications after knight g5 check. It's still a question of forcing the pace for white, as we see. The pawn on h5, well, black has two threats. He's threatening h takes g4, he's also threatening the knight on f3. So white's got to continue with forcing play. And knight g5 check is an interesting piece sack. Well, black is now hit 3 times on e7. He moved aside. Bishop takes e7 was played. Queen takes d4. So one of those opposite colour bishop middle game positions where, yes, white's a pawn up, but look at the state of his king. Radjabov took on h5. Bishop takes h5. Queen e5. And now queen g4 check was played. Queen g3. And now rook ac8. Black is happy to go into an endgame. A pawn down with opposite colour bishops on the board and the exposed white king. It's really quite easy to hold this position. In fact, after rook ac1, Radjabov offered a draw, and Kramnik accepted. Perhaps the easiest way for black is to take on c1 and then play rook e4 with a draw very much on the cards. So maybe Anand's g4, we just go back now to that position, is very sharp, but if black knows what he's doing, he can certainly survive with honour. Okay, well now it's time to look at another example of the main line. This is the game Petroff versus Soko, played in the Austrian Team Championship in 2009. I should stress at this point that black can play knight c6 first and bishop e7 next, or he may play bishop e7 and only then knight c6. It comes to the same. White has scarcely anything better than to castle. And now we get the attack on black's centre with c4, and we know what to do against that. Black should go knight b4. Alright, white takes on d5. Black takes off the light square bishop, thank you very much. And now he moves in with his light square bishop, bishop f5. And we've already seen that unless white tries to sharpen the play here immediately, he's going to get a pretty poor game. Black's light square bishop is going to come into the game very, very quickly, and white will be in trouble. So we've looked at knight e5, we've looked at g4. What about knight c3? This brings us to the game Petroff versus Soko, the Austrian Team Championship, January 2009. And black answered knight c3 with knight takes c3, queen takes c3 forced, and now bishop e6. This is why Anand's g4 was introduced, because bishop e6 gives the black position enviable stability. And now that the e-file is covered, white's got to be a bit careful that he doesn't slip into a bad position. Well, Petroff plays the recommended move, rook e5 here. If white takes on c7, then black gets excellent compensation after bishop d6 and then castles. Black has two nice bishops. He's got pressure against the white d-pawn. He's got threats all over the light squares. He's got activity for his rooks. This position reminds me in some ways of the Marshall Gambit. And white has struggled to get any real advantage here whatsoever. For instance, there was an old game of Smyslov which went bishop d2 with Smyslov playing black, bishop f5, white went queen b3. Black simply took off the queens and then brought his king up, f6 keeping white pieces out of e5 and then king f7. White has a devil of a job keeping his extra pawn, and of course if the extra pawn goes, then it's likely that, you know, white might actually go a pawn down in this position. It's not inconceivable that black might win, you know, several white pawns here because they're so weak. So black is very rock solid here, very stable. His plan involves, for instance, a6, freeing up the queen's rook, activating his pieces, and then trying to go to town on the white pawns. So in practice, white doesn't really want to take that pawn. He has also tried bishop g5. The point of this is that after bishop takes g5, white's going rook e5. But black can easily sidestep that by playing bishop d6. And now I think black is slightly better with the two bishops. White goes bishop h4 to try and neutralise the bishop, and then a3 to free up his queen's rook, but rook fe8, and only black can be better here. Of course, it's not much, but you know, black can play on. The good player can play on in this situation. So white's got to force the pace. Rook e5 was played, and black dropped back with queen d7. And now white continues to force the pace with pawn up to d5. Well, bishop takes d5. Rook takes e7 check. Queen takes e7. And now bishop g5. It looks as though black might be coming into difficulty here after f6, rook e1, bishop e6, and now knight d4. But all this is known. If white goes bishop f4 in this position, which looks quite normal, trying to leave black with some problems on the e-file, then c5 is a very good move, keeping the white knight out of d4, threatening king f7, after which black should be able to consolidate. So white goes knight d4 straight away, and now comes castles on the queen side. An excellent move, securing equality. Petroff got nothing better really now than to take on e6 with the knight. Black takes on g5, white takes on d8, queen takes d8, queen takes g7, and now h5 with an equal position. This type of cut and thrust is typical of the open game, and it's one of the reasons why a lot of players enjoy playing these tactical positions. Well, Kovacevic Soko continued h3, h4, rook e6. White has got perhaps a glimmer of an advantage here with his extra activity. He even managed to win a pawn on g5, but then came queen e1 check, king h2, and now queen takes f2, and now White really has nothing better than to force a draw. Okay, he can easily do that by checking with his queen on the 5th rank, and that's exactly what happened. Draw agreed. A game typical of this line. My conclusion is that in the main line after knight b4, White can and must introduce complications after c takes d5, but Black is surviving. More than that, if White doesn't know what he's doing, Black will certainly get the advantage, as he moves in to take off the light square bishop and then centralises his pieces rather nicely. We've already seen the consequences in the main line for the position when Black is allowed to take White's bishop on d3. We'll run through the main line moves again. I should reiterate at this point that it doesn't really matter whether Black plays bishop e7 first and then knight c6, or knight c6 as here and then bishop e7. At any rate, we come to the main line position after c4, knight b4, and now I'm going to consider Karpov's move, bishop e2, a more positional approach by which White refuses to let Black have the light square bishop and threatens pawn up to a3, getting rid of the pesky Black knight on b4. If this approach is allowed to succeed, then Black may end up in a passive position. On the other hand, White has spent a tempo retreating his bishop to e2, so it should all balance itself out in the long run. Which brings me to the game Anatoly Donskov versus Stanislav Mikhaev, played in the Chigorin Memorial Open in October 2009. And Black contents himself with the common sense move, castles. After that, White plays knight c3. Well, he could go a3 straight away. Then, of course, Black would just drop back to c6. Let's just see this on the board. Knight c6. I'm not sure whether that move a3 is useful to White. I mean, we'll see it actually taking place in this particular game. But for instance, isn't Black comfortable here after c takes d5, queen takes d5, knight c3, knight takes c3, and then bishop f5? This will be a typical Petroff position where Black is in no danger, and he has very free pieces, which should give him easy equality. So going back to the game, Donskov preferred the move knight c3, and now Mikhaev played another very sensible move here, bishop to f5. I think that's just a simple developing move. Black reinforces the knight on e4, and well, I mean, this is just a very sensible piece of play. Okay, White plays a3. Well, Black takes on c3 and brings his knight back to c6. So we're going to get direct transposition to the position mentioned earlier. And now, possibly White's only try for an advantage in this position is to find a good way to push his central pawns, to play c4 and then possibly d5. It's hard to see White being able to muster significant pressure in this position, as Black's development is so free and so, how can I put it, coherent. Black brings his rook to d8, in a sense that restrains the advance of White's central pawns, and now White brings his knight back to d2, perhaps planning bishop f3. Knight a5 by Black, both protecting b7 and again restraining White from playing c4, dissuading him from so doing. And Donskov brought his queen out to a4, after which Black just comfortably protected the knight by b6. So this for me is a fairly standard position in the bishop e2 line. Black has no particular problems with development. The only danger to him is if White's central pawns get rolling. But you know, even if they reach c4 and d5, they can't really come much further. A pawn on d5 can be chipped away at by c6. And, well, Black doesn't really need to leave that pawn on d5 for very long. White has got to get the pawn there in the first place, however. Well, Donskov continued with rook fe1. Black played bishop f6. Another good square for the piece, and white played rook a c1. So everything seems to be hinging on whether white can get this move c4 in. Rook f e8. Again, very comfortable developing move, and white played bishop f3. Queen e6. Okay, that's pinning the bishop on e3. So white plays g3, just giving his bishop on f3 a little bit of air. And black played a useful move here, h6, just giving his king a bit of freedom on the back rank and protecting against any tricks. Bishop g2, and now black plays c6. f4. Well, the position of the bishop on e3 was uncomfortable for white, pinned against the rook on e1, so white gives himself the option of bishop f2 in this position. Bishop comes into d3. That's a good square for the bishop, and black is controlling the light squares here, c4 and b3. White goes knight f3, and now black puts his queen in on b3. Well, white could trade queens, of course, but then I think he would lose his rook on c1. Let's just see that. Queen takes b3, knight takes b3, and now what's white going to do with his rook? If he plays his rook to d1, we go bishop c2. That's an indication of how this position can actually blow up in white's face. Surprisingly, actually, you wouldn't believe it would do that. But, yeah, white's losing the exchange. So after queen b3, he's got to settle for queen b4. Then black goes bishop e7. And surprisingly, white finds himself in a losing position. He hasn't seemingly done anything wrong. Yes, he's going to have some compensation for the exchange after knight e5. But I think everybody would agree that we'd much rather be black in this situation, the exchange up. White's going to get a pawn, but with careful developing moves, black can neutralise white's initiative there with the knight on c6, and now hopefully go on to win with the extra exchange. Alright, knight takes a7. White must garner what he can get in this position. And now the comfortable move here, bishop c4. Bishop d2. Going back, white really does need to be able to put a piece on the e file in this position. You can just see the black. I mean, black's immediate threat, of course, is rook to e1. His subsidiary threat, I would say, very simply, is rook to e2. And therefore, that explains the move bishop d2, which looks rather miserable at first sight, because, of course, it gives back the a pawn. But what choice did white have? We go back to bishop c4. If he plays king f2, he runs slap bang into rook e2 check. So really, winning the exchange was very important. So bishop takes a3, bishop f3, cutting out rook e2 for the time being, but now the excellent move bishop c1, forcing the entry of the black rook into the position and winning comfortably. So the rest of the game really is of little consequence. Black just wraps up a winning position. There's really nothing that white can do about black's extra exchange. The d pawn's going nowhere, because black's rook can easily come in behind it, and well, white's just thrashing around looking for compensation. So here we go, bishop e6, thank you very much, knight b5, rook d3, in behind the pawn, pushing his own passed pawn, and a very nice tactic to finish off. White resigns, knight takes d6, b2, and the pawn queens. So, yeah, Karpov's move bishop e2 is interesting. Black shouldn't fear it though. And this game conclusively shows that black has plenty of good ways to develop his pieces to excellent squares. My next game comes from the MTEL Masters tournament played in Sofia in 2005 between two of the world's top players. Michael Adams, English Grandmaster, playing white, and Vishy Anand playing with the black pieces, a man who needs no further introduction. It's another example of the main line, where we see black developing his knight to c6 and his bishop to e7. White pushes forward with c4, knight b4, and now the uncompromising move bishop e2, possibly threatening a3, driving back that knight on b4. Well, we know what black should do against this. He castles, white plays his knight out to c3, and this time Anand plays his bishop out to f5. So all as before, very comfortable play for black. White goes a3, carrying out his main idea. Black trades on c3, brings his knight back to c6, and now comes rook e1. rather than taking on d5 immediately. White can obviously wait with that capture. The point of Adams's move is to try to force the black pieces into slightly less active positions than was seen in the last example. Well, Anand is able to deal with this idea comfortably enough. He knows full well the threat to him is based around some sort of advance of the white central pawns, and rook e8 fits the bill as a sensible developing move which neutralises any white pressure on the e-file. White takes on d5, bringing the queen into the centre, and now Adams plays his bishop out to f4. So it's my impression that this is a slightly better way to handle the position than for white, of course, than the way we saw in our last game. Now white is putting a little bit of pressure on c7 and forcing a slight concession after rook a c8. Bishop g3. Not only was that bishop attacking c7, it was also coming around to guard the white king if necessary, and bishop d3 is in many ways a typical Adams move. He strengthens his position slightly and puts the onus on black to demonstrate some sort of equality. As I say, white's always looking for the best moment to play c4 and then d5. It's just that in this particular system, if black plays accurately, he never seems to be able to get those moves in. So bishop d6, well, he can get them in, but they would leave the pawns vulnerable, of course. Knight d2, bishop takes g3, h takes g3, and now the characteristic move here, knight a5. Black's position is all about controlling the light squares. Again, that knight comes to a5, restricting the activity of the knight on d2 and monitoring the squares c4 and b3. So queen a4, bishop d7 by black. There were some veiled threats to the rook on e8. That's why black doesn't play b6 in this position. So bishop d7, queen c2, and now b6, covering the knight. Well, bishop d3, prodding black really with the attack on h7. Pawn up to h6, comfortable enough. And now Adams flicks in a check, which is a sophisticated idea designed to push the black king to a less comfortable square than g8. Don't think Anand wants his king in the corner in this position, so he plays it to f8, and only now does Adams play bishop e4. But white is working with very small things in this variation. I mean, what is wrong with black's position after queen d6? White hasn't got any dark square bishop to pressurise the king on f8. The king on f8, well, it can be used as a defensive piece, really, nailing down that rook on e8. I don't see that white has any sort of advantage here. And Anand continues sensibly with bishop e6, again reinforcing the control of those light squares. White brings his knight into e5. Black plays bishop b3, and after queen e2, Anand attacks the black centre with c5. Now this is a critical moment in the game, because for the first time really, black is actually starting to look as though he's mounting pressure. The bishop on b3 is very useful because it prevents a rook from coming to d1, and therefore, you know, white has to resolve the position of his pawn on d4. Adams decides to try to resolve it tactically by bringing his queen into the attack. Now there are definitely possible threats of queen f5, which would threaten mate, and after that queen h7. There's also an idea of putting the knight in on d7 at some point. So black has got to be careful. He first of all cuts out the idea of knight d7 by playing rook c d8, and after bishop f5, c takes d4 was played. C takes d4, and now comes knight to c6. Well, black is evidently hoping to take away any of his problems by exchanging pieces. White takes on c6, and then chopped on e1, and now took on c6 with the queen. Queen e2. Well, of course, this threatens queen e7 check, so black stops that with queen d6. Queen f3. Bishop comes to c4, queen e3, and retreats his bishop to b5. Rook d1, bishop a4, rook d2, and now rook e8. So let's try and assess this position. Okay, endgame wise, black is in good shape. He's got the better pawn structure, and he's got the possibility of creating an outside pass pawn. White, for his part, has a temporary initiative, Black's gradually sapping away at that initiative with moves like rook e8, but Black has to be careful about that passed pawn on d4. The pawn may advance and tie Black down. So there's an intricate piece of jousting over the next few moves, with both players jockeying for position. Black would love to exchange the queens in this position, I think, and White meanwhile avoids the exchange. The point is, the exchanges tend to favour Black, who has the better endgame here, and with the centralised king, Black could, after the exchange of queens for instance, bring his king to the centre to try to restrain White's passed pawn. So queen g5, bishop comes to h3. Actually, that's a placement of the bishop which gets Adams into trouble in this game a bit later on. Black plays king g8, and now the white passed pawn comes forward. So f5, cutting the bishop on h3 out of the game, and I think Anand's planning to answer d6 with bishop d7. Rook d1, covering the back rank, and now queen g6. Everything's protected for Black, and now Adams is lured into coming over and taking off the pawn on a7. It looks for an instant as though White may be getting the upper hand here with his extra pawn, but the precise problem for White is that bishop on h3, as I said. Anand has shut that bishop out of the game, and this, over the next couple of moves, is going to be what costs Adams the game, as Anand now moves forward with a surprising move g5, and now what does White do? His bishop's trapped on the edge of the board. He does have a strong passed pawn, but actually he's going to lose that bishop. g4. This is the best that Adams can do. Of course, Black takes the offered piece, but White's hoping to get a little bit of compensation here by giving a check and causing an inconvenience to the Black king by giving numerous checks. Well, Black can block those checks and gradually improve his position. White tries to pin the bishop. Black protects quite easily. Another check. King comes up, queen c3, queen e5, queen d3 check. King comes back to g7, queen c2, rook h8. Eventually Black is able to defend his position and finally get the upper hand. Queen h2 check. That's the terminal move. A couple of checks more. And now it's time for Black to resign. White to resign, excuse me. So, well, of course, king d2 is answered by queen h6 check, after which Black wins. The king must go to a very vulnerable square, perhaps to the c5. He goes to the c file. We have rook c8. Let's just go back to bishop e2 one more time then. Let me just summarise. I think Black gets a decent enough position in this line. It's quite tricky to play for White. As we've seen, one of the world's top players is unable to extract any advantage. Your general task in this opening with Black in the initial stages is to concentrate, as so often in the Petroff, with quick pointed development, and then later on to restrain White's central pawns. The plan of a3 I wouldn't say is enormously dangerous to Black, but of course it must be respected, as in all these Petroff lines. But Black should be able to achieve good play. Well, Black's position is looking reasonably comfortable in the main line after an immediate c4. So are there any other ways for White to play this variation which give Black difficulty? Well, White can obviously mount some sort of pressure in this main line. Once again we see Black developing his bishop to e7 and White castles. Now we're going to look at the game Alexander Morozevich versus Lazaro Bruzon, Cuban Grandmaster graded 2652, and this game comes from Vaikenze in 2005, where Black played a slightly unusual move, now bishop f5, White goes rook e1, and now Black plays his knight out to c6. So I think we have to imagine in this game that Black has played knight c6 first and only answered rook e1 with the logical bishop f5 thereafter. Clearly Bruzon's move order is possible and even directed against h4. Well, anyway, in this game we're looking at rook e1 now in place of the immediate c4, and bishop f5 is obviously a decent reply. Now it's clear to me that if White doesn't do something straight away, once again we're going to reach one of those positions where Black's supremely logical development will stand him in good stead. You know, black's going to castle, he'll just move his queen up, say to d7 or d6, bring his rooks to the middle, bishop comes to f6. It's all very easy and comfortable for him. So this is why Mirosevic moves immediately in with c4. And the difference between this line and the others we've looked at already is that if black goes knight b4, white can retreat his bishop to f1. Karpov's move bishop e2 was looking a little clumsy. So bishop f1 is slightly more harmonious, and once again white is thinking about the move a3. Now if we just go back to knight c6, are there any other moves in this position which can be played? Well, clearly white can go knight bd2 here. That's a logical alternative. But simplest for black in this position seems to be knight takes d2. And if queen takes d2 here, we go bishop takes d3 and then castle. If white plays c3, we go a6 to keep the black queen out of b5. We then move our queen up and we centralise our rooks, intending to answer rook a e1 with bishop d8. White's probably got to give his king a little bit of air here to get anything, and now the simplest move is rook takes e3, queen takes e3, and then queen f5, with a nice, stable, equal position. Going back to the position after knight takes d2 then, can white get away with bishop takes f5 in this position? Well, not sure. What happens after knight takes f3? And the problem for white in this position is that if he takes back with the queen on f3, the d4 pawn is hanging. So it's not that easy for white to just destabilise the black knight on e4. Obviously white can play a3 in this position, castles, and only then play c4. Well, once again, black is pretty comfortable here. There are plenty of moves to consider. Bishop f6 could be one such move, knight e5 another, knight d6 a third. So, to cut a long story short, c4 is the most incisive move. And once again we get knight b4, bishop f1, and now black castles. Now we're back with the game Mirosevic brews on. Well, white played a3, driving the knight back to c6. It's arguable whether a3 is useful to white in this situation, because it weakens his light squares, notably c4 and b3. As usual, white takes on d5, drawing the black queen out into the open. He plays knight c3, and we get a typical scenario in this variation of, you know, whether the white pawns in the centre can come forward and cause black inconvenience by so doing. Well, bishop f6, bishop comes to f4, and the queen drops back, covering c7. Knight d2, and knight e7 was played by Bruzon. Probably knight a5 is another possibility here. But knight e7 also looks quite compact. And black is intending to answer queen f3 with c6. Well, the first impression that I have when I see this position is that maybe white has a faint edge, based around the fact that he's got one rook in the game and black hasn't got any similar development. But black's pawn structure, of course, is much more compact than white's. And long term, this could really start to matter. I don't see any immediate way for white to get his central pawns going. And the bishop on f5 is extremely useful here, because it's preventing white from playing rook b1, which would create some pressure on the b file. Basically, I think black is okay here. Well, knight c4. Knight comes to g6, hitting the bishop. Bishop drops back. Bishop g4, attacking the queen. Queen d3, bishop f5. And with this move, black states that he's happy with the draw, should Mirosevic go queen f3. I think that would be a reasonable and logical way to end this particular game. However, Mirosevic stubbornly plays on with queen d2. And there's now a little bit of toing and froing in typical Petroff style, where black just centralises his pieces and awaits events. Nudging the bishop off the h7 b1 diagonal means that white can now play rook a b1, but black is happy to play b6 here, as it not only blunts the white rook on b1, it also stops the white knight from going to a5. White is working with very limited tools in this position if he wants to construct any type of advantage. So the bishop comes to f5, knight comes into d6, there's a trade on d3, and now Bruzon gives the white knight a boot out of the aggressive square. And after knight f5, he drops back economically with bishop f8. Again, the impression is that white has a faint edge here due to his more active pieces, but it's very easy for black to neutralise this type of advantage. He just keeps on offering to exchange pieces, which we see with an exchange, a doubling up of the rooks. Bishop drops back, and white would of course love to have an entry square on the e file for his rook to come to e7, but of course it doesn't exist. White continues to try to press, possibly with the thought that he might activate his rook either to g3 or h3. Black plays rook e8. White sees no future in playing rook h3 or rook g3, instead continuing with h3, giving his king a bit of space, and now black just centralises his queen's rook. So the last piece comes into the game, and the more pieces that come off, the more worried white's got to be about his pawns. But, you know, the impression is that this game should end in a draw, really. Well, Morozovich is extremely combative. He'll stop at nothing to sharpen a position. Of course, after rook takes e3, he could easily have taken with the queen. After that, I really don't see that that black is troubled in any way. I mean, for instance, after queen takes e3, black can simply play to centralise his queen with queen d5. This looks perfectly reasonable to me. And the queen is perhaps en route to c4. There are certainly weak white pawns here to observe. This is an equal position, but it need not be a draw. You know, there are plenty of opportunities to play on with black, it seems to me, in this position, because of white's weak pawns on the queen side. So perhaps Morozovich just feels that if he plays normally and takes the open file, you know, his queenside weaknesses are by far the most important feature of the position. Whereas after f takes e3, at least he can perhaps hope to create some pressure on the f file, or maybe push his central pawns to cramp black a little bit in the centre. Again, Bruzon plays ruthlessly here. Bishop d6, aiming to exchange pieces, and once again the exchange of bishops is offered. Morozovich retreats to f2, seeking the victory, and now black plays the expansionist f5, and then bishop f6. So all the squares covered. Good technique in the Petroff. Can't see what to do, the position's too difficult. Improve your position in small ways, and this is exactly what Bruzon is doing here. He's covering more squares with his pawn and his bishop move. e4. F takes e4, a move made possible by the exposed position of white's queen. And white recaptures. Bishop g7, and rook comes to e1. So black is still being slightly troubled by the open file. Well, queen to d5, and Morozovich comes into e7. Now, of course, he could have traded the queens in this position, but rook takes is perfectly reasonable. If white comes into e7, black has rook a5, defending himself comfortably. Should be a draw at least for black. Meanwhile, going back to queen d5, queen takes d5, I wonder whether pawn takes is also not possible, perhaps intending to answer rook e7 this time with rook c8. Both variations seem comfortable for black to me. So this is why Morozovich goes in with queen e7 and black plays rook to f8. Queen takes a7, and Bruzon goes up a gear slightly now by putting his queen into c4, and after queen takes b6, he goes queen takes c3. So temporarily, black is a pawn down here, but of course he's now threatening bishop takes d4 check, and the bishop on g3. So he's going to get the pawn back. King h2, bishop takes d4, and now it's just a question of whether white has anything on the 7th rank. Bruzon thinks not. He covers his 7th rank. Rook e7, okay, this is fair enough. And now king comes back to g8. So surely in this position, this is going to be a draw. I mean, black really has no choice. If white wants to draw, he can play queen e8 check and queen e7 check. But once again, Morozovich is hampered really by his own temperament, and he plays on for the win by putting his queen on c7, drawing the black king out to e6, and then he pushes the pawn up to a5. All right, fair enough. Pawn up to h5, a6. h4. Now the point of this move, of course, is to answer bishop takes h4 with bishop e5 check, winning the white queen. So white repositions his queen here with queen d6 check, queen f4 check, and then queen takes h4. But now comes the start of perhaps the black counterattack with queen e3. And it's clear that either Morozovich was in time trouble or that he completely underestimated this move. This is a typical scenario in the Petroff. In my estimation, the Petroff is really underestimated. Not necessarily at Grandmaster level, but at Master level and beneath. It's a supremely logical opening, and Black's counter chances can last all the way through the game. Mirosevic has tried very hard to press here, but Black has played very consistently, and now he's going to reap the benefits of that consistent play, because suddenly there's no real way for White to look after his king unless he goes bishop f2. For instance, what is White to play if he goes bishop f4, freeing up the king? There's no check with the queen to speak of. In comes the queen there, and then bishop f2. So Mirosevic has to surrender his bishop, and he probably couldn't quite believe what was happening to him here, as Black now goes on to win this game, blockading his pawn, bringing the king to the centre, and there's nothing really Mirosevic can do to stop this. All he's got to do is to run out of moves here and await defeat. I mean, it really is quite simple. White tries to bring his king over to gobble the black pawn, but there's no way to do this. And in this position, Bruzon decided to resign. Let's just see what happens after king c6, because it is worth consideration. Black pushes his pawn, in comes the white king, and of course Black now simply moves his bishop all the way down the diagonal. And that's the end of that. So I think what I'm saying is, going back to the position after rook e1, that bishop f5 is a good move for Black. We've seen that each of c4, a3 and knight bd2 aren't particularly troublesome for Black. In each of these lines he should be able to maintain steady development and a solid position. Let me show you a game by the master now, Anatoly Karpov playing Black against Michael Adams. This game comes from Dortmund. 10 years old, back in 1999, but still with relevance today. We'll see time and time again throughout this DVD how difficult Michael Adams has found it to face the Petroff. Here Black plays the classical move order with knight c6 and bishop e7. These two moves are interchangeable. Adams attacks the knight with rook e1, and now Karpov plays the sensible move, bishop f5. As I've mentioned before, unless Black is challenged immediately in this position, he's just going to get a very good game by castling, moving his queen up, and then bringing his rooks to the centre. So Adams hits with c4, and now Black goes in with knight b4. And of course it's completely senseless for White to surrender the light square bishop in this position, so bishop f1 is the move. Alright, Black castles. White hopes to gain a little bit of time here by pushing the knight back to c6. Knight comes out to c3. Karpov chops on c3 and now brings his bishop coherently to f6. Bishop f4, a nice active location for the bishop. Karpov takes on c4, and after bishop takes c4 he just brings his queen up to d7. So a continuation of the same defensive plan we've seen earlier. Black's plan now is perhaps just to put a rook on the e-file and invite White to show any sort of advantage at all. And really I just don't think there is any advantage in a position of this type. So maybe at Super Grandmaster level the game is already tending towards a draw. Although at club level, of course, this position can be played on by either colour. White is perhaps thinking about the slightly extra activity his pieces have developed. Black is certainly considering trying to take advantage of White's pawn structure as the game progresses. But there's a natural balance and harmony in this position which tends towards equality at the highest level. Well, Karpov now plays b5. What he's trying to do with that move, of course, is to freeze the white pawn structure. Bishop g5 by Adams. And now, very interestingly, Karpov allows White to double Black's pawns here with bishop g6. Bishop takes f6. G takes f6. Of course, by so doing, he gives his king the chance to come to g7, which gets the king out of the gaze of the bishop on a2 at least. There's no real way for White to take advantage of the kingside pawn structure, and well, White's got to be a little bit careful. Black is thinking about creeping up on White here with a move like queen d6, eyeing the queenside pawns. It's a sharp position. f4. Knight comes back to e7 to cover f5, and after queen f2, Karpov played knight f5. White goes g4. Knight takes h4, queen takes h4, and now in view of White's threat of f5, Black pushes f5 himself. Rook e5. f6, rook c5, rook comes to e3, and white was getting a little bit afraid of black's activity here, so Adams offered the exchange of rooks on e1. Karpov brought his rook across to e8, queen g3, and now bishop comes to f7. Another very interesting move, of course, because white gets the opportunity to take on f5 with check if he wants it. Bishop takes f7, queen takes f7. Once again, white is given the opportunity to take on f5 with check, but he refrains from so doing. In fact, Adams played g5. Let's just have a look at these continuations. Firstly, g takes f5. Well, after that, black drops away into the corner. And now black has a number of threats. Major piece endgames depend on activity, and black's activity is pretty ferocious. In fact, that rook on c5 is a little bit out of the game here. Rook g8 is the immediate threat. Queen a2 would also be a nasty threat, getting active, and rook e2 a third threat. So I don't think that continuation for white holds out much hope. Similarly, rook takes f5 is very good in the material sense, but after queen a2, white's king is really going to come under heavy fire. So that's why Adams prefers to press forward with g5 here, hoping to drum up some activity after king h8, rook takes f5, but now Karpov's on the ball with queen b3. It turns out that Adams has calculated this out to a draw here with g takes f6. He understands the pawn on f6 is so dangerous, black's got to move in and take a draw here, and that's exactly what happened. Queen came to d1, check, king came to g2, and now the very accurate move, queen c2 check, preventing king h3, as the rook will go on f5 with check. So king g1, queen b1 check, king g2, queen c2 check ended this exciting and interesting game. Summarising, I think rook e1 in the opening is one of white's main moves, but it can be met successfully with bishop f5. If white doesn't go c4 in a position like this, black is very comfortable. If he does, black can deal with it with sensible developing moves. We've seen, I think, that black's mainline system, his answer to white's fifth move d4, d5, then bishop e7, then knight c6 is extremely reliable. Which brings us to the game Carlos Silva Sanchez versus Stephen Solomon. And this game was played in the Thessaloniki Olympiad in 1984. Basically, there aren't that many deviations for white in the main line that makes sense. The move order in this game will quickly reach our desired position, although Solomon played bishop e7 first, and only then d5, no matter it comes to the same. And what else is left for white if he doesn't go c4 or rook e1? Well, there's knight bd2, and as usual, black answered this move with the solid bishop f5. This variation is not to be feared, and black can easily answer queen e2 here, which is the only move to put pressure on e4 with knight d6, as Solomon did. Silva Sanchez traded on f5, and then he played queen d3 to protect his pawn, after which black played the comfortable queen d7. So another one of those variations where black is getting ready to castle, to centralise his rooks, and to claim a perfectly equal and respectable position. Well, white played knight b3, trying to make something independent of his setup, and then he brought his bishop to f4. Black sensibly centralised his rook, and then he actually pinned down the knight at f5 by playing g6. Now at least the black queen can be mobile if need be. White played c3, and black played b6, another effortless move, keeping the white knight out of c5. So white retreated the knight to d2. Black played f6. I think this is a sign that Solomon's thinking about playing for the win. He's keeping a white knight out of e5 by so doing. White doubled in the e-file, and black played knight f7. So an almost Lasker-like performance so far by black. He had a perfectly equal game. Now he's kind of trying to create some complications here. But Silva Sanchez just keeps it very, very solid, and black is unable to break the deadlock here. He likes moving pawns. White moves the knight up to g4. Black covers his king side a bit more by playing king g7. White offers to exchange the knight off on f5. And then black acquiesces in the form of an equal endgame after bishop d6. And really, after all the pieces are exchanged, there is nothing left for it than both players shaking hands. Okay, the game continues for a little bit longer, but really the result is no longer in doubt. Knight endings are very similar to pawn endings. Well, here it's completely equal, really. Pawn, king f5, c5, knight b5, g3, g5, knight f1. Both players are stubbornly playing on, but the deadlock cannot be breached. g4 check, last little trick. Knight g4 check, blocking up the pawn structure, knight b5, and a draw was agreed. So let's summarise the position after knight c6 now, at the end of our investigation of this main line. Black's setup is solid and reliable. Whether white plays c4, rook e1, or as here, knight bd2, as we have seen. In most cases, black can get the bishop to f5 with comfortable equality and easily develop his queen and major pieces. It's the ease with which black can get his pieces out that attracts a lot of players to the Petroff. No cramp as in the Rye-Lopez, no tactical variations to overcome as in the two knights defence, just solid, stable development. This approach, this rock-solid approach, suits a lot of players. And you know what? In club chess, this approach can also pay great dividends, because a lot of white players are going to become impatient and overpress, become too optimistic about their position, and black can then step in with his solid position and take advantage. Okay, well that's the main line after knight takes e4. Now it's time to look at a few white sidelines in that variation. As white's chances have not exactly been forthcoming in the main line, white players, especially in the top levels of chess, have looked for other ways to put pressure on black's position in the main line. And one of these is to play knight c3. This has become increasingly common at the highest level of chess these days, just to try and get an interesting position against the Petroff, to avoid the symmetry of the main lines and black's easy active play that he finds there. White's idea in this system is very aggressive. He wants to develop his queenside pieces, put his bishop on c1 on either e3 or f4, play queen d2, castle on the queen side, and then launch some sort of kingside pawn storm. And initially, white's results were very good. Which brings us to Anand versus Kramnik, Chorus Vikings 2008, and the move bishop f4. We'll have a look at bishop e3 next, but first of all we should see how black plays to get a good position against this line. When in doubt, follow Kramnik. He's rock solid, the epitome of correct play in chess, and in this game, in the bishop f4 line, it's important to put the black knight on c5. The black knight on c5 deters white from playing bishop d3. It eyes the e4 square, and it sets the bishop free on c8. So lots of good things with one move. And in Anand versus Kramnik, white played bishop back to e3. Now in a similar game played at Vikings in 2008 as well, Mickey Adams played knight d4 against Kramnik, and black got a very comfortable game there after rook e8, f3. This is thematic, planning g4, and then h4. Knight e6. Obviously, if white swaps, well, I mean, all he's got to look forward to is a gradual exchange of pieces by black and the worst structure. So Adams played bishop e3, black played bishop g5, f4, knight takes d4, and in order to keep any semblance of advantage whatsoever, white had to unbalance the position after f takes g5, knight c6. But after h4, I do like black's chances in this position. The e5 square is key, and we'll see Kramnik using that square to advantage as the game progresses. Basically, I don't think white's got anything here. I mean, I think his kingside pawn demonstration is just really a rather token gesture. Adams never gets any further with the advance, as Kramnik moves in with the accurate bishop g4 and then plays queen d7. I think at this stage Mickey took the view that he's got nothing and he should play for a draw, and that's exactly how the game turned out. In fact, it fizzled out here with black playing rook e5, white chopping on c6, setting up an opposite colour bishop middle game position, and after bishop d4, rook takes e1 check, rook takes e1, and now rook e8. Black was in perfectly good shape. There was no way for white to decoy the black queen away from the defence of the rook on e8, therefore no back rank tricks, and the game meandered to a draw in a few more moves' time. So of course Anand could not be satisfied with that. You know, at this level you've got to press with white, and so he tries the move bishop e3, after which Kramnik plays rook e8. Now again, in another game from the same Vikings A tournament, Kramnik also tried c6 against Peter Leko. Leko took on c5, but is he really better here after queen a5, bishop d3, bishop e6? I very much doubt it. After a3, bishop f6, black was comfortably equal, and this game was again drawn in 28 uneventful moves. So back to Anand versus Kramnik now, and rook e8, which looks like a good move to me, perhaps slightly better than c6. White tried bishop c4, and Kramnik played bishop e6. Anand took on e6, black took with the knight, and now h4, thematically setting up the prospect of kingside attack. Well, Kramnik is a master of coherent play, of coordinating his position, of effective development. Therefore, the manoeuvre of the queen to c6 was a highly reliable way to play this position. In a previous Anand-Kramnik game, white had played c4, bishop f6, g4, but after g6, again, black was very comfortable. So this time round, Anand played queen f5, attempting to keep the pieces on, and now queen c4 gave black counterplay in view of the attack on a2. Well, white played king b1, black played g6. Again, this is a very coherent move. The pawns all cover white squares, black's bishop is good, his knight is centralised. Really, white's attack on the king side is very difficult to carry out. And Kramnik again stopped white stone dead there by playing h5. Alright, knight d2. The problem for white is that a bad endgame is lurking in the wings here if things go wrong. If he doesn't prosecute his attack, you know, really he's got no compensation for that queenside pawn structure. So black always has hopes of playing for the win in a position of this type. And Kramnik continued to take away squares from Anand by playing d5. f3, queen comes across to a4, and of course black has to be careful now in view of the move g4, which is exactly what Anand played, trying to open up lines against the king. Well, bishop d6 happened, queen f2, and now Kramnik cold-bloodedly took the pawn on g4. And I think his idea is that if white goes h5 in this position, black's going to go g3. And that's a very useful move, holding white up. So, after h takes g4, white recaptured, and black again cold-bloodedly took the pawn with queen g4. Rook e g1 was played, and now queen h5. So Kramnik must have entered into this position in the full knowledge that it was risky, but that, as he couldn't see a way through, he wanted to play for the win with black in this position. After all, he's now a pawn up. Well, there was a little bit of toing and froing here, and now Kramnik continues to play on for the win here with rook d7. With rook e8, of course, rook e8, he could have secured a draw immediately. Anand brought his knight into d4. There was a further exchange, and now bishop f8. It's remarkably difficult for white to budge that black queen on h5, and while she's there, she's holding up the entire white attack. Queen came back to e3. Of course, it demands a great deal of patience to unravel this position, and, well, patience, of course, is a quality Kramnik displays in abundance in his games, and therefore it was easy to see him manoeuvring this rook to e6. Well, rook g5. That's an only move, I think, by Anand, getting rid of the black queen in order to play h5. And I must say, it does look dangerous for black in this position. But rook a e8, threatening tricks on the back rank. There's no time for white to take on g6 just yet. And after bishop d2, Kramnik played bishop to c5. Another very bold move. And once again, back rank tricks rear their ugly head here if white takes on g6. This is a bad move. Queen takes h3, takes on f7, king takes, and white can't recapture due to the move rook e1 check. So Anand's got to retreat with rook g3. Black went rook e2, again very disruptive, hitting the bishop. King came to c1, and now the point of black's defence, queen g7. White played a3, and black played bishop d6, after which the white rook retreated to g1. Bishop c5. There's another natural balance in the position seemingly occurring, and this time it's white who plays on for the win with rook g4. Okay, rook 8 e6. Finally, white gets the chance to strip open lines, but everything is in order for black in this position. White played bishop e3. He could try, of course, putting his queen on c8 check here, but that doesn't really come to much. For instance, after the move queen f8, when everything holds together. So, bishop e3 was played. Queen e5, attacking the bishop. Queen h7, king f8. Bishop d2. Queen comes to f6, queen takes b7. And now rook comes to h2. Rook e1. Queen f2. King b1. Queen takes d2. And now the interesting move, rook f1 check. Anand sees a chance to sacrifice a piece in order to completely bear black's king. But Kramnik is nothing if not cool, and queen g2 check was an excellent move, more or less forcing white now to accede to a draw. And this is exactly what happened after bishop c5. Queen takes g8, king takes g8, rook f5, rook d2, c4, king g7, b4, and now bishop e7. The two players agreed to a draw in this position. Going back to our opening discussion, it seems that an immediate bishop f4 is well met by knight c5. And we're going on now to look at another game with this idea. Of course, the very best players in the world have an acute instinct as regards certain types of position in chess. And we've seen quite a bit of cagey play in the main line, where black defends himself toughly by putting his knight up on c5. Let's turn our attention to the game Wróblewski-Shirov from the Russian Team Championship in 2006 and see what happens when white goes, if you like, all in with this variation, and after knight c5 plays h4. Now when you're facing Kramnik in this line, or Anand or any of the other really top players, it's hard to smash them up. And we're going to see Wróblewski come a cropper here as he tries to take Alexei Shirov apart in this main line with crude moves such as h4 and knight g5. Well, black's first task in this position is clearly to develop his pieces, but he's got to attend to white's idea now of the attack against his king. So Shirov first of all plays h6, and after f3 responds with rook b8. Wróblewski plays g4, and now black is quick to get counterplay on the queen side with b5. It's evidently worthwhile remembering this idea, where black aims to force through b4 to get counterplay against b2. Wróblewski continued blithely on with the move bishop d3, and black played rook e8, not only to take a file, but also to create a square for his king on f8. Wróblewski went tanking in with bishop h7 check, and finally the knight was obliged to retreat to h3. But now it's time for counterplay, and this of course Shirov is exceptionally good at. And he moved through with b4, c takes b4, and now a5. An excellent response to white's outright attack on the king side. Well, what is Wróblewski to play here? He tried g5. Obviously, if he takes on c5 in this position, we get bishop takes b2 check, king b1, and then bishop c3 check, which I don't think is very promising for white, to say the least. So g5 is consistent, you might say, and now Shirov played bishop takes h3. Well, I think black is really in the ascendancy here. He's getting ready to take white apart here with moves like queen d7 and perhaps queen out to the queen side. So Wróblewski took on f6, queen takes f6, typically of Shirov finding a way to sack a piece. And now if rook takes h3, we go rook takes b4 with a dual attack on b2 and f4. That bishop on h7 is spectacularly out of the game. So c3 by Wróblewski, an attempt to shore up his king. Shirov rips open the lines on the queen side. C takes b4. Once again white can take on h3 in this position, but then black takes on c3, giving only problems to white because of the hanging bishop on f4. So c takes b4 was played, knight a6, a3, bishop f5, bishop takes f5, queen takes f5. We reach a position now where remarkably, after all the fireworks, material is level, but it's white now who has the more exposed king. Rook hg1 was played. Knight takes b4. Absolutely typical Shirov this. Sacking a piece to continue the attack. And now rook a8 was an extremely dangerous move to have to meet. White's queen is chained to the defence of the bishop on f4. Rook a1 is mate, so black's, threatening to win the game immediately. White tried b3, but then came rook a1 check, king b2, queen f6 check. And unfortunately for white, that move is exceptionally strong. His problem? Well, he has no decent moves. If he goes king c2, rook a2 check picks off his queen. Meanwhile, if he blocks with the queen on c3, well, at the very least, we've got rook a2 check winning the queen. Finally, if he goes queen d4, which is the toughest move, well, black can take this if he wants to, and then take on g1, again with an easy win in all variations. So it's not so easy for white to just put black away in this line. He can make some demonstrations on the king side, but Shirov's plan of rook b8 and then b5 is well worth taking on board. My conclusion is that bishop f4 has a certain attraction for lots of the best players in the world these days, but in reality black can defend himself successfully and maybe hope for counterplay himself after knight c5. Now, in the system where white plays with an early knight c3, you'll recall that on the 7th move he can actually develop his queen's bishop not only to f4 but to e3 as well. However, this does leave the e5 square beckoning a black knight, and the most effective defensive method for black is to develop the knight to e5 as quickly as possible and to follow up with castling on the king side. All as played in the game Cheskovsky versus Motlaev, played in the Moscow Aeroflot Open in 2005, when we're going to see a pretty effective demonstration by black of how to play this position. Well, Cheskovsky took a little time out now to play king b1. This is quite normal in this line, and black answered sensibly by developing his bishop to e6, after which white brought his knight to d4. As I've said before, in general in this line, white's aim is to push his kingside pawns up the board. Of course, the bishop on e3 can act as a target for black's pieces, and therefore knight c4 is a logical move by black, more or less forcing the exchange of light square bishops, well, bishop for knight on c4 in fact, because black's taking on d2 with check. So off comes the bishop, and now white begins to charge on the king side. Well, in my view, this is hardly likely to succeed when black is in a position of more or less completed development. I can't really see any weak spots in black's camp. Perhaps one might consider g7 as slightly weak, but how on earth is white going to get at it? He really wants a knight on f5 in certain positions, and black should be able to do something about that. Well, Motlaev's bishop is driven back to a6, and I guess the idea now is to position a white knight on f5. Well, black defends very economically. He allows the knight to come into f5, and now he plays his bishop to f6. And not surprisingly, white plays bishop d4. White's main idea in this position is to uproot the dark square bishop and then to get to work against g7. Well, Motlaev is right on time with counterplay, and he played rook e2. White brought his queen to f4, still entertaining hopes of attacking g7, and black played queen e6. Knight e3. Rook e8. Black contents himself with centralisation. Obviously white can now take on f6, but after queen takes f6, it's not really coming to much. I mean, white can even exchange the queens in this position, but black is left with very active pieces. And he notes that knight d5, for instance, is answered by rook takes f2, and if knight takes c7, we bring our rook to e2. Black is certainly not losing this one. So Motlaev Motlife was reasonably happy with this position. Cheskovsky tried to shut the bishop out of the game by going c4. Black liquidated on d4, and then he played queen e5, a very sensible move, forcing the exchange of queens. Well, white defended the rook, off came the queens, and now of course we see that after b6 there's no real danger to black's position whatsoever. White can perhaps play for a small nibble, as we say here in England, by putting the knight in on d5, but the rook comes to c8, and as usual in these lines, white's got to be careful that after the pieces are all liquidated, he doesn't end up in a bad endgame. So in fact it's white in this position who has to play with care to hold the draw. Of course, Cheskovsky is an old campaigner. He knows how to handle this position. A draw is fairly inevitable. White activates his rooks to the maximum. Black just defends himself. Rook c4, king d7. Rook cf4, king e7. And the two players mutually agree to a draw. Just going back to king d7 in this position, white can try rook fc3. Black answers with rook c8. And both sides have mutual weaknesses. So that gives an indication of black's defensive chances in this line. Time now to move on to a more recent game. Well, you know, I forecast that this line is going to go out of fashion, the line where white plays knight c3. It's rather crude. It does lead to original situations, but I think they're on the verge of not exactly being played out, but I can confidently state that black has a comfortable position in both the lines whether white plays his bishop to e3 or to f4. You'll recall when white's bishop's on e3, the most effective way is to place the knight on e5 and then to cast on the king side, allowing white to strut his stuff on the king side in the full knowledge that really black's position is fireproof. Now to the game. Dembo, international women's master, international female grandmaster I think from Greece, playing Antti Saric. Both of these players are graded 2-4-40 at the time of this game. And white played a slow move here, king b1, whereupon black just centralised the pieces with rook e8 and bishop f6. White makes a token demonstration on the king side. Now there might be some ideas of playing the bishop to d3. Well, black just cuts that out, fine and dandy, with bishop f5. And now you begin to wonder what the white knight is doing on g5. I mean, it's hardly likely that white is going to be able to sacrifice this knight. So Dembo decides to retreat to h3, but already bishop takes h4 is confirming to me that white's opening idea has not been a success. White has had to sacrifice a pawn, it seems to me quite unsoundly, and over the course of the next few moves, Antti Saric simply refutes white's play. I mean, all Dembo does is thrash around trying to find compensation for the pawn. She's got one half open file as compensation, and that's about it. So black just neutralises the pressure. More than that, white has serious, excuse me, that was a slip of the mouse, serious dark square weaknesses. If I can hit the right keys on the keyboard, it would help. White has serious dark square weaknesses there, which black crawls all over in the course of the next few moves. Well, white does not, of course, play queen e3. That was my silly fault on the keyboard. Plays rook d e1. And black just takes over the dark squares now by putting the queen on g5 and then the knight on f4. Basically, white is losing this position. And white clamps down on the black clamps down on the dark squares here with rook e3, queen f4, and then rook a e8. So power play here by Antti Saric. The rest of the game really is miserable for white, as black tries to find the most effective way of realising the extra pawn. Basically, in a position like this where you're winning hands down, you want to avoid risk. So king f8 is the first sign that, you know, black is getting the pieces off light squares, out of the range of white's bishop. Black is controlling the game here really, and it's just a question of technique here, as Saric continues to block the white pieces effectively out of the game. So essentially white's attack's at an end. She's just got to wait for the inevitable finish really, as black finds the most effective way of winning this position. He first of all advances the queenside pawns. Then he takes the 7th rank. Finally, he plays bishop f7, aiming for a winning major piece endgame after bishop takes f7, king takes f7. White retreated the rook, rook b5, a4, rook d5. And in comes the second black rook onto the 7th rank. It's amazing to me that actually White manages to prolong this game as long as she does. It's testimony to Dembo's fighting nature, really. But essentially, there's no hope here for White whatsoever, mainly because she has no counterplay at all. Well, Sarich decides to give up the 2 rooks for the queen and play queen a5. The 2 rooks need targets to latch onto. They're not coordinated yet, so White has to spend another pawn in order to get the pieces working together, but Black works constantly to make sure this doesn't take place. f4. Well, now rook hd1 will be answered by king e6 here, and again Black is holding everything with interest. Really, the main plan here is to push the queenside pawn. So we start off with, say, queen c5, then b5, a5, b4. White will be getting squeezed in the ensuing positions. So Dembo plays f4, trying to keep the black king out of e6. Well, a5, rook hd1, king e6, f5, check, king d6 doesn't really help White. The avalanche of pawns on the queen side is inevitable. Dembo tries to keep Black out by playing the rook to a1, but queen e8 emphasises Black's control. There's a little bit of toing and froing with the queens, but eventually it comes to b5. Actually, White couldn't stop this queenside pawn avalanche in the long run. b4 is the culmination of Black's plan, and as we will see in the coming play, White has nothing. Just got to march to and fro. King comes to c6. Rook d1, queen e7, excellent move, and now White is running out of moves. King comes to a1. Well, I suppose rook takes d5 looks like it's a continuation, but then queen e4 check wins the game hands down due to the fork of the king on b1 and the rook on d5. So king a1, queen e5, rook f1, queen e3, king b1, queen e2. The queen is crawling all over White's position. And with a3 coming next, Dembo decided to resign. Let's go back to the critical position after bishop e7 then. So basically here, White has a fundamental choice. This opening, this line, has become very popular in top grandmaster chess over the last few years, but in my view, it is it's going to take a nosedive in popularity. The most effective way against bishop e3 is to safely bring the knight to e5. Against bishop f4, Black plays the knight up to c5 as quickly as he can. For instance, after queen d2, knight d7 castles the queen side, and now an effective square for the knight can be found on c5. With both these defensive ideas, Black not only holds the position, there's a definite promise of more due to White's slightly weakened pawn structure. The next system I'd like to take a look at is, I'm afraid, rather boring. It's the line where White plays queen e2 on move 5. Unfortunately, Black's hand is forced in this position. He must play queen e7, and now White plays d3, insisting on the exchange of queens. Fortunately for Black, this doesn't lead to any opening difficulties for him, but well, it depends on your view of the position. As Black, I'd be happy that I had managed to equalise so easily, and the Black position could still be played on for a win, although of course in this simplified situation it's very difficult. Usually this opening is used, this variation, at grandmaster level when the White player simply wants a draw. Boris Spassky was perhaps the most famous proponent of this variation. He used it on many occasions. He won the occasional game. Most of the games were drawn. In general, this is okay for Black, and the simplest reply is to exchange the queens on e2 check. There's another line where Black plays knight bd7, that's also okay, but let's stick with simplicity for the time being. And one of the main points of this move is that although White's got a nominal advantage in development, Black can nullify this with the help of the move c6. Now White usually castles on the queen side, and this leads to a bog standard position in this line. It's a line which defies analysis, precise analysis. What's more important is an idea for where the pieces should go. And so for that we turn to the game Timman versus Karpov, Tilburg 1980, where Black played his knight to a6. This is a coherent move. It doesn't interfere with the bishop on c8, and the knight's going to drop back to c7. Well, Timon does the best he can. He centralises his rook. Black's idea is to put the knight on e6. This forces a further exchange, and in this position it's, well, completely level, I would say. Black's got a flexible choice of where he puts his king. He's got no weaknesses, and well, white can try to press black here with a move like f4, but Karpov played d5 and he remained comfortable. Well, what's interesting about this is that black keeps his king in the middle. Seeing the endgame coming up, the king is a strong piece. Why not keep the king in the business area of the board? Timon seems a little bit flustered by this, plays his knight to e2, and Karpov centralises the rook. Knight g3. How is white going to play on for a win in this position? Well, he can play his knight up to d4. It's true, this doesn't look like the most secure square in the world. There's no reason why black should let white have the bishop here. Just bishop d7, and again, black is very, very comfortable here. So knight g3 was played, perhaps threatening f5, and Karpov played g6, whereupon the knight went back to e2. Alright, bishop d7, and now Timon continued to press, perhaps unwisely, with the move c4. Karpov is in his element in such positions, sapping the strength out of the enemy position, and he took on c4 and played knight g8. So I ask you in this position, what actually have the moves f4 and c4 achieved? This would be a typical scenario for this variation, where white looks as though he's pressing, but in fact what he may be doing is just creating difficulties for himself for the future. And in fact, white lives to regret these moves in the ensuing play, as Karpov, by economical play, slowly pushes back the white pieces, focuses in on the weakness at f4. Okay, black gets the chance to exchange a pair of rooks as well. Timon has to play a defensive move. Bishop e6 is played, b3, and now bishop comes to f5. Interesting move. Now it's the white king that may feel the more exposed of the two. King b2, rook d8. You see, the thing is, white is working with very limited armoury. He can't put too much pressure on black's position because it's so solid. And as you can see here, you know, black's king is in the right place. He's got more active bishops. It remains to play a move like king f7 and then get his knight into the game. So bishop f2. Bishop takes f4, very interesting move. Now if knight takes f4, rook to d2 check is coming. g4 by Timon. Bishop e5 check, king c1, bishop e6. And now Timon takes on a7. That was clearly the idea, but of course he runs into rook a8. Well, bishop comes back to d4. Rook takes a2. Of course, by this stage, black is much better. He's a pawn up. He's got a coordinated position. All his pieces are more active than their white counterparts. And after g5, knight d7, Timon resigned. This shows great respect for Anatoly Karpov, but of course the pawn on h3 is very weak and probably disappearing from the board as well. And, well, all of black's pieces are just better, like I say, so he decided to resign this one. Not an especially impressive game by Timon, but it gives you an indication of the lacklustre nature of this variation. Like I say, white will play it when he wants to draw, but there's absolutely no reason why you should acquiesce to the draw. Taking on e2 is most effective, and then c6 and then knight a6 should serve you in good stead. The final system for white, if you can call it that I'm going to examine here, after knight takes e5, d6, and then the retreat of the knight to f3, knight takes e4, is c4. This is a very old-fashioned move, the primary point of which is to dissuade black from playing d5, and thus freeing up his game. Well, white's hoping to just attack the e4 knight a little bit later on by playing d4 and then bishop d3, and by so doing gain a bit of time. The problem is that this plan is a little bit slow, and black has plenty of resources against it. Notably, after bishop d3, black may retreat his knight to g5, and by simplifying the position by exchanging a pair of knights, take away all of his problems. Which brings us to the game Movsesian versus Volotikin, two very heavy hitters. This game was played in the Russian Team Championship in April 2009, and it represents the latest thinking on this subject, this rare subject I might add, where Movsesian plays the unusual move bishop e2. Yes, well, I think he's trying to just basically take play away from normal channels in the Petroff. He's essentially admitting that black's opening is very reasonable, and he wants to find something original against it. Far more common in this position is for white to play d4, and after castles, bishop d3. But now comes the key point of black's defensive strategy. He wants to play his knight to g5. And if knight takes g5, bishop takes g5, queen h5, black has rook to e8 check. Now, if white wants to continue the initiative, he's got to move his king. So let's say king d1, and now black can recuperate with h6. This looks as though it might be a little bit awkward for white, but in fact he can keep black's edge to a minimum by simply exchanging off all the pieces here and playing knight to c3. If bishop d7, knight d5, we have knight a6, and if c5 in this position, black has bishop c6 with a reasonable position. Going back to the position after bishop d7, well, white can continue to try to pretend he's got something here with king d2. Then comes knight c6, just getting the pieces out. And now after knight d5, rook a c8, black has no real trouble neutralising white's very slight initiative. For instance, after king c3, he can play knight e7. And after h4, which has actually been played in the game Kengis versus Akopian, USSR 1990. Black played pawn up to g4, king c3, and once again knight e7. Knight e3 was played by white, king f8, g3, knight g8, rook he1, and now knight f6, with a nice equal game. So going back, I guess this is why Movsesian tries to improvise with bishop e2. But he doesn't get anything at all from the opening. Black just castles. The knight comes out to c3. Black takes. And now white interjects a further original twist to the game by taking on c3. But we know what to do against such pawn structures. We play solidly. We aim for simplification. And, well, we take away most of white's chances by so doing. In fact, the rest of this game is a rather miserable experience for Movsesian, as he seeks chances in a position where really there aren't any. Black finds a very accurate deployment here of the queen's bishop. The queen on c2, white's queen, was preventing the bishop from coming out to f5. So this time, black positions the bishop on the long diagonal, and, well, ideas of bishop e4 are definitely in the air. Rook fe1 was played by Movsesian, a5 by black, freezing the queenside pawns, and now seeing a hole on b5, white brings his knight in. Bishop g5, systematically exchanging pieces, and after bishop f1, black played the very accurate move rook e5. You see, exchanges in this position really do favour black, who has the better pawn structure, getting ready for the endgame, and in fact it's this factor in the position which costs Movsesian everything in this game, as black continues to systematically organise exchanges. For instance, that knight on e6 is incredibly strong, radiating power. Knight f4 is interesting. Knight c5 is interesting, black's covering c7, all sorts of things with one move. So queen d2, off come the queens in a shot, bishop c6, g3 hoping to activate that light square bishop via h4 and bishop h3, but black ruthlessly trades off. He understands that this endgame is very similar to, let's say, something like the exchange Rye-Lopez, where white has the devil of a job using his pawn majority, 4-3 on the queen side, to create a passed pawn, whereas for black it's much more straightforward. So despite all best efforts by Movsesian to trade down into some sort of tolerable endgame, he ends up much worse. Black is able to push his pawns, to open a kingside file for his rook, and to win a long endgame. Movsesian tries very, very hard in this endgame to activate his rook, but, well, actually, Volotikin continues to play on for the win, and with some justification. He's seen a long way here. This is the start of a combination where black moves forward with his rook, and in the end gets to a very favourable rook and pawn endgame. I mean, Movsesian puts up an heroic struggle in this position. He's hoping to use that b pawn as a distraction, And it's not so easy for black to activate his king. But try as he might, he cannot draw this endgame. I mean, obviously the threat is rook takes b5, and white clearly cannot go passive now, in view of black's threat of rook b3 check, driving the king back and then advancing the a pawn. So he's got to try a few checks. The king comes all the way in, and now white plays rook d5. And just at the moment when it looks as though he might be drawing this endgame, unfortunately for him, black's f-pawn is going to have the final say. It looks to the very end as though black is going to draw this, rook e3, but rook takes e3, f takes e3, a2, a surprise is waiting round the corner. b7 was played, but in fact Movsesian resigned this position. And at first sight it doesn't look as though he should be resigning, because both sides are going to queen. Well, I think the move Movsesian underestimated here, and this wasn't played by the way, Movsesian resigned, was f2. This is surprisingly awkward to meet. I mean, you know, white has some checks here. For instance, he can check on c7. Then comes king d2. He can then check on either d6, after which king e2 is winning, or he may check on d7, after which king e1 is winning. But the checks come to naught. Black's pawn is touching down, and after a1 queen, b8 queen, f2, if he goes queen h2 trying to pin, he runs straight into queen g1 check. So another game which confirms the solidity and reliability of the Petroff. Going back to the opening, c4 is a very old-fashioned move. Remember the idea of bishop e7 and knight g5. This serves you in good stead when you're facing the d4 variation, as here when Movsesian decided to freak out with bishop e2. Well, once again, black just got a very comfortable game with normal, sensible chess. Well, now we move to an even earlier point in the game, in the knight takes e5 variation, where white has a couple of alternatives to retreating the knight to f3. And the first of these is a very violent Cochrane gambit, knight takes f7, which may well be used by a lot of attacking maniacs, but black objectively has nothing to fear. In fact, I'm going to suggest that black fight with fire in this variation, and hit out after d4 with c5. This was the choice of Alexei Shirov when he faced Nigel Short in the FIDE Dubai Grand Prix Rapid Tournament in 2002, and I think it's a good move. Black takes immediate steps to break up white's centre, at the cost of leaving his king in perhaps a slightly more exposed position than it would be otherwise if he played other lines, such as g6 for instance. But on the other hand, he has plenty of counter-attacking opportunities in this line. I should mention, if we just drop back a couple of moves to the position after king takes f7, that bishop c4 here, whilst it looks logical, is perhaps not quite as good due to d5. And if he takes d5, black has bishop d6 in this position. With castles, then simply rook f8, d4, and black castles artificially with king g8. It's hard to believe in white's compensation in this position. In fact, I would say black has a very promising kingside attack. So with bishop c4 out of the question, the main line is undoubtedly d4. Then comes c5, and now you see it's not so easy for white to maintain his centre. For instance, if he plays bishop c4 check, then black plays d5 again, and after e takes d5 he goes bishop d6. This is the key idea in this line when black is threatening rook e8 check. So for instance, d takes c5 here, rook e8 check starts to look very good for black. So that's why white generally castles in this position, and only now does he take on c5. But you see, d6 discovered check doesn't really achieve anything. It only serves to weaken the d pawn. Black goes king f8 and he's fine. So knight c3, bishop g4, queen d3, knight bd7 will be natural. And you see both sides are getting their pieces out, but you have to prefer black's active counterplay. He goes knight e5, bishop takes e5, rook takes e5, rook a e1, queen e8, queen d2, rook c8, knight b5, king g8, d6, and now king comes into h8 with advantage to black. All as played in the game Yandavirov versus Plizetsky in Moscow in 1983, when black's activity really should sway the assessment of the position in his favour. So in short versus Sheeroff, short took on c5 and now the uncompromising knight c6. Yes, white can play bishop c4 and he did, luring the black king out into the open. But with every exchange of piece, the black king starts to feel a lot safer. And you know, black has an extra piece getting ready for the middle game. So short castled. Going back. Well, he could prefer c takes d6, but all this seems to do to me is to attract the black pieces to come into the game. Black runs away with king f7 and should have the upper hand here due to his extra piece. Yes, white has 3 pawns, but black is extremely active and he's already threatening to take on e4. So going back to king takes e6, we've got knight c3. That's a sensible developing move. Again, I think black should run away. Queen e2 threatening a check. Queen d7 parrying the check with queen e6 should it be played. And if c takes d6, bishop takes d6, f4, rook he8 emphasises black's leading development and again should give him the better game. So short castled. Now Sheeroff's got 2 moves here. He can play d5, that has been played, or king f7, just running away. And again, over the subsequent course of this game, black slowly gets the upper hand. He forces white to lurch forward with his pawns. The knight comes into e4. In this current position, white's got actually 3 pawns for the piece, but surely one of these pawns is going to be lost. Short tried knight c3. Sheeroff took off the knight correctly and then blockaded the pawn with queen e6. Rook b1 was answered by rook b8, and now short made an attempt to protect the pawn on c5 with bishop e3. Sheeroff completed his development with bishop e7 and rook hf8, and after bishop d4 continued the process of castling artificially with king g8. Again, you know, this position is very unclear, but you have to say that that white is not really attacking anymore. Instead, he's condemned to defence, really. Yes, he's got 4 pawns for the piece, but 4 of them are isolated or tripled. So Sheeroff continued to batter away at the white pawn structure. He played g5. Short took on g5 and took on f8. He played queen h5, hoping to stir up trouble. Sheeroff played his queen across to g6, and white went queen f3 check. Well, you know, white can trade queens here, but the black king is perfectly placed to just come up to e6 and start gobbling the very weak white pawns. So queen f3 check, king g7, queen takes d5, and now queen takes c2. e6 check, uncompromising chess, and king g6 was the only move really to make sense, protecting the bishop on g5. Rook f1 still looks dangerous for our hero, but queen d3 holds the fort. Queen d7, and now bishop e3 check. Bishop takes e3, queen takes e3 check, king f1, and now king h1, and now the key move here, rook f8, when of course white can't take that rook in view of back rank, checks and mate. So rook g1 very passive. Of course you have to remember this was a rapid game, so the initiative is of key importance here. Of course Sheeroff is absolutely fantastic at getting the initiative. Now the threat's knight to g4, short stops it. Then comes knight to d3. The final incursion of the knight. Knight takes c5, it's round up time. Queen takes e7. The whole position has fallen apart in short's time trouble. And the knight comes to e4. Well, of course, you know, there's a lot more to the Cochrane Gambit than that. But I think that in general, c5 is a very good reply. It's a counter-attacking move. Yes, white will probably get 3 pawns for the piece, but his attack will be neutralised, and black can think about counter-attack himself. An uncomfortable fact which white might not like to consider when he plays this swashbuckling gambit. I think what I'm saying is that knight takes f7 is an interesting move. It deserves to exist for that reason alone, but objectively, black is okay. What have we learned about the Petroff so far? Well, I think we've undoubtedly seen that the Petroff is a very solid, reliable way to play with black. Black must always keep pointed development in mind, not letting white outstrip him in any way in terms of developing the pieces. I think the black position is extremely reliable, it's extremely solid, and it's extremely durable. I think these are the lessons we learned so far, and it cannot be shaken by unorthodox means. Which brings us to my next variation, which is a rather unusual way of playing for white. I don't think you'll have to face it very often, but when you do, you can feel sure that black gets a good position after knight c4. Again, this is a very old-fashioned move. It dates back to the 19th century. White's idea really is to reroute the knight to e3 occasionally and just create unorthodox play. I don't really think that it puts any particular difficulties in front of black, and that by normal means, knight takes e4, black should be able to get a very reasonable position. Well, now we're going to follow the game Morozevich versus Topalov, played in the Melody Amber tournament in 2005, where white played knight c3. But before we go on with that game, we ought to just consider the consequences of d4, d5, and now knight e3. Well, this was played in the game Kamsky, Wang Yui, both 2700 plus players, Vikings 2009, and in countless other encounters. Black has a perfectly reasonable way to play here in Queen f6. There are obviously other moves like Bishop e7 which clearly come into the frame, but Wang Yui's solution to the problem was simple enough. He just played knight to c6. That threatens Queen f6 directly, which would fork the white pawns on f2 and d4. So white would play c3, black goes knight f6, and now by the simplest means, black exposes white's play as slightly artificial. The knight on e3 is just getting in the way. Kamsky moved it up to f5, black castled, relying on development to see him through. And Wang Yui continued to chip away at the knight on f5 by playing knight e7, while Kamsky took the bishop, and hoped that the advantage of the two bishops would mean something in this symmetrical position. Well, black continued to cover all bases by playing c6. The knight came out to g6, and bishop d7 prevented any serious problems on the e file. White is, how can I put it, grinding on with the two bishops, but black has plenty of counterplay here, and may introduce his ideas of knight f4. It really is very difficult for white to make anything of this bishop pair advantage in this symmetrical position. So Kamsky simply settled for bishop takes g6, and this led to equality after h takes g6, queen d2, knight f6, bishop f4, queen f8, bishop e5, knight h7, knight c2, f6, bishop g3, queen f7, and then g5. The black pawns on the king side complement the bishop perfectly, and white has only a very nominal advantage, if that, in this position. Black's next plan will be to redirect his knight back via f8 into the centre. So, you know, knight c4 is a little bit artificial. Morozevich, being a great original player, tries to make something of it with knight c3. Of course, we know what black should do against that. He should double the pawns, and as we've seen so many times before, just play completely rationally here with d5, and now knight to f6, and we reach the same sort of position we've seen time and again on this DVD, where white's got fragmented queenside pawns. In return, he's got, you know, a degree of activity, I would say. But does the knight on e3 really do anything here? I wouldn't say so. And Topalov moves on to the attack with c5. Alright, bishop b5, check bishop d7, queen e2. Bishop takes, queen d7. Essentially, black is offering white the chance to go into an endgame where, you know, black's chances are by no means worse. Morozevich only delays the decision for one move. Black plays a6, off come the queens, rook b1, and now b5 is a very interesting move. And the point of b5 is to sacrifice a pawn here to get the king up to c6, and now to push the pawn onto c4. And suddenly white's got a few problems in this position. His pieces are tripping over each other's toes, and despite his extra pawn, it's very difficult to, how can I put it, dampen down black's coordination. Black is extremely well coordinated in this position, and rook a2 conclusively demonstrates that. Morozevich tried to nullify the effect of black's rook. Black doubled up, off come a pair of rooks, and now g4. Alright, bishop f4. Now black is zeroing in on c2. White played king e2, and now of course black could play bishop takes e3 followed by rook takes c2, but instead he prefers bishop d6. The knight was repositioned on g7, and white played h5, after which black took the pawn on h5. Knight f5 was played, knight takes f5, g takes f5, and now rook takes c2 sets up threats for bishop f4. White played king d1, black played rook a2, rook takes h5, rook a1 check, king e2, and now rook a2 again set up the threat of bishop f4. So king e3 by Morozevich, and one must not forget this was a blindfold game played in this tournament, so small mistakes are permitted. Black is trying to activate his pieces to the maximum. He plays rook c1 hitting the bishop. The rook protects the bishop. King d7, and now rook a1. This is a very long game, not strictly relevant to our opening discussion. I don't think black is worse in this position despite the extra pawn. Eventually Morozevich lost this game against Topalov. We'll just see how this was done, but well, for a blindfold game it's very difficult to keep control in a position like this. King takes f5 even for great players like Topalov. There was a bit of toing and froing. King came to f6, bishop e1 threatening a check on h4, rook h2 cutting out that threat, bishop h4, king g7, king f3, f6, king g4, rook g2 check, rook h2. Essentially this position is about level. Rook e2, and now rook c2, force bishop e1. Black pulled his bishop out to a5. Difficult for white now, rook h4, bishop takes c3, and after rook g4, king f7 was played. After a further 20 or so moves, Topalov went on to win this game. Let's just see how he does it. He essentially gets his pieces into the best possible positions first, and then goes on to push that past pawn. So, king c6, king b5, and now king a4. In came the black king. White goes to and fro, hoping for salvation. It's not to be found. Of course, white is getting tortured in this position. Bishop comes to c3, into d2, very strong. This is the overall winning plan. Now comes the advance of the passed pawn, and once that pawn starts going, it really is game over time. Well, rook takes g5 was the last desperate try. Rook h3. The pawn is easily stopped. And after rook f3, Morozevich resigned. Now, just going back to the opening. Okay, knight c4, what can we say about this? Well, just to summarise, I don't think knight c4 is a particularly appealing move when you consider the advantages of some of the other lines that white has available. It will be played by unorthodox players who want to surprise you or who want to introduce an original twist into the game. White's knight often comes to e3, but this doesn't appear to be particularly effective. By sticking to the basics, looking for an opportunity to play d5 as early as possible, and then to free up his pieces and to play in the normal Petroff style, black obtains easily an equal game. We now come to the complex of variations where white immediately opens up the centre against the Petroff with 3d4. This is a very important line and cannot be overlooked. I imagine this will crop up very frequently at club level. Now, it has been proven that the most reliable move for black here is knight takes e4. Black can take on d4 with the pawn, but that gives white more chance to get the advantage. After knight takes e4, the idea is to reinforce the central knight by playing d5, and now battle is joined. D takes e5 in this position is surprisingly rare. Well, I say surprisingly, but perhaps this gives black a little too much leeway in development, in terms of development. I mean, it's quite easy for black to find good developing plans against d takes e5, whereas against knight takes e5, it's more difficult. So knight takes e5 is overwhelmingly the main line in this position, but we should definitely look at d takes e5 closely, because I'm sure it's a move which is going to crop up at club level on a frequent basis, where theoretical knowledge, especially in this position, will be rather sketchy. Now black has plenty of freedom to develop his pieces in typical open game fashion, but one effective way is just to go knight c6 and then bishop g4. Black is targeting the pawn on e5, and this was the game Sutovsky versus Motlaev, both players in excess of 2650, both strong grandmasters. This game was played in Russia in June 2009, and it will highlight, black's chances in this line, and perhaps why white doesn't choose d takes e5 that often. Black's game is simply too free. In some ways, the positions remind me of the open Ruy-Lopez, where both sides can get their pieces out rather easily, but this is much better for black than that variation, because you'll recall in the open Ruy-Lopez, black has to weaken his queen side with a6 and b5 in order to get the type of freedom he enjoys here, whereas in this position, no such weaknesses on the queen side exist for white to jab at, for instance with a2, a4. So, if white gets to this position, he's probably got to be modest and settle for a move like knight bd2, after which black just takes and moves his bishop to e7 with a very comfortable position. But in this game, Sutovsky, who actually struggles against the Petroff, Sutovsky is an attacking player, a creative player. Well, the Petroff is tailor-made to play against this type of opponent, because they find it really difficult to get any type of creative play going against what is, after all, supremely logical play by black. So h3 was played, and Sutovsky's idea basically is to create a very unbalanced position after g takes f3. Note that queen takes f3 is answered by knight takes e5. G takes f3 looks ghastly at first sight, because isn't white just opening up his king, almost fatally, you might say? Well, perhaps he is, perhaps he isn't. I mean, Sutovsky wants to win this game and is creating an unbalanced situation. He's confident in his powers, he likes his central pawns, and he thinks, well, okay, I can play this position. It's a bit different to the normal Petroff fare, and black can't really play too solidly against this. It's going to be a sharp struggle, come what may. Well, Motlaev joined in the fun with queen h4. I think this is a good move, getting the queen over to the king side before white brings his own queen out, for instance to g4 or maybe h5. White now plays knight c3, and this is the first interesting position of the game, because in the game Motlaev castled on the queen side. Now already you could be forgiven for wondering why black doesn't take on h3, and so was I when I first saw this game. I think against that Sutovsky was intending bishop e2, and this is a surprisingly awkward move. White intends to regain his pawn, the pawn on d5, and he keeps options open of playing bishop g4. Sutovsky's confident that he won't be mated in this position because he's got a light squared bishop. The only sensitive spot here really in white's camp is g2. Well, black's never going to make white on g2 in this position when he hasn't got a light squared bishop. If black wants to save his pawn, he's probably got to go d4. And then it seems to me that a natural balance exists in this position after knight b5, threatening the fork at c7, and queen d7. Obviously, if black castles here, bishop g4 check would win the queen. So queen d7, bishop g4, queen d8, bishop f3, threatening bishop takes c6, and then knight takes d4, and now queen d7. And probably this is already burning out to equality. But of course, black would be relatively happy with that. This is why the Petroff is such an effective weapon at the highest level, because in general, when you're playing a Super Grandmaster, a draw with black is not at all a bad thing. So Motlaev, anyway, decided to cast on the queen side. White went bishop f5 check. Clearly this is white's main trump here, the light squared bishop. And after king b8, he went queen g4. Imagine his surprise when Motlaev played knight d4. And the first point to notice here, that if queen takes h4, we go knight f3 check. White's got to probably play his king to h1, and then knight takes h4 with a pretty good game for black once again, because of the doubled pawns by white. The more pieces that come off, the better it is for black, really. That knight on h4 might look sidelined, but it's in fact covering a whole complex of important squares, and white's pawn structure is rather weak. So with the worse pawn structure, Sutovsky has to find a better way of exchanging the queens. He plays rook to d1. Black forced the issue with h5, so we're going to get a very similar position to the one we just looked at, except that this time white has vacated the f1 square for his king. So perhaps this is a slightly better scenario for white than the one that went before. Although even here, black is very comfortable. Alright, knight came to e2 and now g6. Typical strengthening move there, just improving the structure. And, well, black should have no difficulty, because what he's going to do here is chop off the bishop on d3, create a square for his knight on f5, and then with the pieces coming off, he's still going to be slightly better. c5. Motlife is definitely thinking about playing for the win here. White's opening experiment has not really succeeded. White doubled up, black pushed on, white dropped back. Perhaps white is hoping to jab with c3 and get rid of that pawn on d4. Well, again, black is not troubled. He brings his knight back from the remote h4 square to the beautiful f5 square in the centre. White plays knight g3 to try and get rid of that knight. And now, very interesting decision, king c7, allowing white to double the pawns, but at the same time fixing white's central pawns on the same colour squares as his bishop. In this position, what you do is count the number of pawns on the same colour square as the bishop. Black has 3 pawns on black squares, white has 4 pawns on black squares. I think for this reason, black was hoping to perhaps play for the advantage in this upcoming endgame. And in fact, it's actually surprisingly difficult for white. Sutovsky opens up with his rook to come to the g file. Black challenges. No big deal there. Rook d3, and now king c6. And now comes the critical point with white playing c3. Of course, what white has got to be careful of here, if you look at the respective pawn majorities, black can create a passed pawn on the queen side. Black is the only one who can create a passed pawn in this position because white's majority is lamed. He's got 4 pawns to 3 in the centre and on the king side, but there's no way of getting a passed pawn. And this is why, as the pieces still continue to tumble off the board, this is why black holds the advantage in this position. c4, very interesting indeed. Black gives up a pawn, but instead he gets his king into the beautiful square on d5. And now he's thinking about, with the white pawn solidly blockaded, pushing those pawns up on the queen side. Obviously white can play bishop e3 in a position like this, but you know, black has the easy move bishop d8 here, and white can't be thinking about holding his extra pawn in this position. Bishop b6 is coming, and then we're going to get a king and pawn ending, which is easily winning for black with his queenside pawn majority. So very well calculated move, this king d5, and now white is in serious trouble. He's reached the nightmare scenario of a lost bishop ending. Round comes that bishop to b6. King takes d4. From now on, black makes this game look rather easy. Another pawn goes down the drain, and now the simple bishop e3, forcing a winning king and pawn ending. So that's the type of thing that can happen to you in the d takes e5 line if you become too creative. Black played extremely well all the way through, exceptionally solidly, and refuted white's slightly dubious opening concept. As white players have become increasingly frustrated with their lack of success in the main lines at the highest level, they're looking for ways to play in unusual fashions against the Petroff. And d takes e5 has been seen more frequently, more out of desperation than anything else, I think. Which brings us to the game Judith Polgar versus Andrei Istratescu. And this game was played in the Dresden Olympiad in November 2008. Again, we see black employing our favourite setup, just bringing the knight out to c6 and the bishop to g4. And this time, Polgar decides to play knight c3, reaching another one of those creative positions where white gives up the queenside pawn structure in return for attacking chances. This time Polgar's got the b file, and she's got free play for her pieces. Well, in my view, black should be holding here. There's nothing wrong with this position, and Istratescu plays a sensible move here, bishop c5, and follows it up with castling. So white plays h3, bishop h5, and now in order to stop queen d7, which would lead to very coherent development for black, Polgar plays bishop f5. King h8, a rather interesting move. You wouldn't think this move was necessary, but perhaps black wants to play f6 in this position without allowing the white bishop into e6 here. Well, white played g4, bishop g6, queen d3. So Polgar is hoping to make something of that bridgehead on f5. She's created a point here, a bishop which is difficult for black to shift, or at least she hopes so, and behind this bishop she's hoping to mount an attack. Knight e7, bishop g5, pinning the knight, and now black plays very carefully over the next couple of moves, just systematically unpinning the knight, giving him enough time to develop his remaining queen's rook into the game on e8. Bishop g3 was played, bishop takes f5, g takes f5. So I suppose you could say that Polgar has succeeded in her aim of reaching an unbalanced position. But just because you play the Petroff, it doesn't mean you should avoid unbalanced positions. On the contrary, you should be willing to embrace unbalanced positions when your development and your setup is so solid. So, for instance, here, black plays queen c8. Now, is the white pawn structure dangerous, or is it overextended? Polgar pushes forward with f6, and Istratescu plays the knight to g6. And now comes the parting of the ways. In the game, white played knight g5, hoping to stir up some action there with ideas on f7, h7, and possibly with e6 in the wings. Perhaps a more natural move here was f takes g7, but again I think black is holding on after king takes g7, c4. I mean, white must open up this position. D takes c4, queen takes c4, and then b6. Black just anchors the bishop, and after rook a d1 we have queen f5, queen e4, chop, chop, and then rook d8 with a nice equal position. And again, some hopes for black in any upcoming endgame. I think black's pawn structure is slightly more secure than white's in this position. White's got, what, 4 pawn islands to black's 3. And, yes, I quite like black's chances here. At any rate, he's not worse. So perhaps seeing this variation, I don't know, Polgar played knight g5. Black took on f6, took on e1, and in typical Petroff style, played rook e8. Which is actually quite an interesting move, because it involves temporarily sacrificing that pawn on f7. King g8 was played. There are 2 white pieces tapped now, so Polgar took on e8. She brought her knight back to g5, and black went queen d7. White went queen e2. Bishop came back to f8, and now f7 check was played. This all looks rather dangerous, but actually the pawn on f7 is rather vulnerable, and black easily managed to hold on in the complications after knight h6. King 8, so knight e6 check, king h6, knight takes f8, queen takes f8, queen takes f8, knight takes f8, bishop d6, and now king g7. White is winning. White is losing the pawn back, I should say, excuse me, and well, the position was agreed drawn here, but actually black could have played on. This shows respect to Judith Polgar in my view. I think black could simply take that pawn on f7 and play on for the win. Well, anyway, that concludes our brief discussion of d takes e5. You won't see this move too frequently. When you do, I think knight c6 and bishop g4 provides a very good answer. Well, we now turn our attention to the main line proper after d4, which is knight takes e4, bishop d3, d5, and now knight takes e5. This line gives white slightly better chances than d takes e5, and is the preferred choice of most grandmasters. It's a logical move. It lets the white queen come into play should this be necessary, and keeps more options open than does d takes e5. And the move I'm recommending against knight takes e5 is knight d7, which has been the most popular continuation for black at grandmaster level in recent years, and I think it's probably the easiest one to understand. Black seeks to challenge the e5 knight and get rid of it as quickly as possible. It's annoying to him, it's in the middle of his position, so he wants to exchange it off. This is a very logical continuation, and is a key line of the Petroff even today. I think it's going to work very well for you at club level because it is so appropriate to the needs of black's position. Now, the first question white has to answer is, should he allow black to take on e5 or not? And if he doesn't allow that capture, how is he going to deviate? The first move I want to look at is castles. I mean, I think that's a natural move which a lot of white players are going to play. But I think knight takes e5 and then knight c5 is the way to meet it. Again, this is a very sensible continuation from black's point of view. He just takes off white's pesky knight and then he brings his knight round to c5 to try to get rid of the light square bishop. And in practice, white has a very difficult task proving any sort of advantage at all. Which brings us to the game Tiviakov versus Van Wely, played in the Netherlands Championship in 2002, where white tried knight c3. And the point of this move is to set up an immediate threat of knight takes d5, given that queen takes d5 will be answered by bishop b5 check. Just going back, white can obviously try to retain his bishop with bishop e2, but then black's development is not interrupted in any way. The pieces just flow out. And I guess you could say that this pawn majority on the king side is something white would be hoping to perhaps make capital of in the middle game, but black can easily deflect this with moves like d4 and then bishop f5, and if bishop g4, queen d7, well, after bishop takes, queen takes, black's position is very, very comfortable. Obviously, if queen takes d4 here, queen takes c2. Black is fine. Going back to the position after knight c5, because black's development is so free, white's choice is limited. He can try bringing his queen out to f3, then comes bishop e6, and now knight c3. Well, I think there we just lop off the bishop. Queen d7 and then c6. Again, easy equality for black, and maybe more. You know, who knows? He might be able to use this light square bishop constructively as the game progresses. So knight c3 by Tiviakov has become regarded as the main line move, but you know what? I think taking off the bishop on d3 is best. White does certainly have some sort of development advantage here, but black has two nice bishops. Tiviakov took with the queen. Well, he could take with the pawn. Then I think just simply bishop e6 and queen d7 is satisfactory. And if white plays queen b3 to tickle black by attacking b7, we just go c6. There was a game which went knight e2, bishop e7, queen g3, and now black sharpened play up by castling on the queen side. This leads to equality, as queen takes g7, h5 is very dangerous for white, who faces a tremendous black attack now with the upcoming rook dg8. It will be most unwise for white to go into this continuation, so returning to castles, well, this is just an equal position otherwise. So queen takes d3 by Tiviakov. c6, knight e2, and now g6. Black is trying to emphasise the power of his light squared control, because that's the piece white doesn't have, the light squared bishop. So queen g3, bishop g7, and now knight f4 was played. Castles, obviously far too risky for black to take that pawn on e5 due to rook e1. But after castles, Tiviakov had prepared a little surprise, knight h5. Imagine his shock when Van Wely took this piece, answering bishop h6, which looks good, with bishop g4. Well, white can obviously regain the piece here by taking on g7 and going h3, but black went queen g5, breaking the pin, and white now played f3. So this is the crux of the whole matter. f5. Turns out black can defend himself. E takes f6 check, rook takes f6, and now f takes g4. Who is pinning whom? Rook a f8. Rook takes f6. Rook takes f6. Rook e1. If you ask me, this position is already tending towards a draw. H takes g4 was played. Tiviakov took back with the pawn, and now Van Wely safely covered the second rank with rook f7. Queen c3 was answered by queen f6 and queen e3 by h6, preventing g5. Of course, black's always got this queenside pawn majority in the wings, and it has to be respected. There's now a threat of queen takes b2 in the position. So white played c3 to block that out, and in turn white is threatening queen takes a7, so black played a6. Between two strong grandmasters, it's hard to see this position ending in anything other than a draw, and that's exactly what happened after queen f3, queen e3 check, rook f2, and the two players shook hands. So I think what I'm saying, going back to knight d7, is that castles allows black easy equality after knight takes e5 and then knight c5. Black has considerable freedom of movement, and well, he threatens to take away the bishop pair from white. I think white has to do better than this if he wants an advantage against knight d7. The next variation is something of a dance on a volcano, which might seem like a contradiction in terms for the Petroff defence, but it's an outwardly very sharp line, where after our favoured knight d7, white goes in for knight takes f7. Obviously, if you don't know this continuation with black, you could be in trouble. However, I think black has two good ways to meet it. There's a safe way in king takes f7. White can go queen h5 check, that's the point. But now king e7 I think is the best move and forces white to go queen e2. I don't think there are any tactical continuations here for white. Bishop takes e4 followed by bishop g5 is answered by knight f6. Otherwise white's a piece down. And after queen e2, black's best is to go king f7, and then queen h5 check would lead to a natural balance in the position. However, I'm recommending that we do slightly better than that, and we play queen e7 in this position. And we're about to see an incredible game here, which took place in the United States Championship in St. Louis in May 2009, where Grandmaster Julio Becerra Rivero, graded 2609, decided to take that rook on h8. It turned out, I'm not sure whether he was right to do so, but it turned out that black actually didn't know his theory here, because knight takes h8 is not a particularly good move. Queen e7 in the main line involves black in a pawn sacrifice, but black gets a very dangerous attack here after queen e2, queen takes f7, which is the main line, and now f3, which is answered by knight d f6. White will win a pawn, yes, but he falls dangerously behind in development, and black can whip up some interesting attacking chances on the king side. For instance, if white takes the knight on e4, black must waste no time in getting his pieces into the game, and bishop g4 is the move to fit the bill. If queen e3, black takes on e4, opening up the game. That's what you have to remember. Develop quickly, open up the game in this line, and now castles on the queen side. If white castles, black goes queen h5, bringing all his pieces to bear against the white king. Black's ideas in this position include rook takes d4, when white can't capture the rook in view of bishop c5, and bishop d6, eyeing h2. So h3 is probably logical, and now rook takes d4 is very interesting. H takes g4, knight takes g4, bishop f5 check, king b8, bishop takes g4, and now rook takes g4, given as advantageous to black by Artur Yusupov, presumably because of the idea of bishop c5, which is so difficult to stop. So going back to the position after knight d f6, white has tried knight d2, refraining from the capture on e4 for the time being, and asking black to find a useful move here, given that bishop g4 isn't available. Well, queen h5 fits the bill this time, and after f takes e4, we're going bishop g4 again. This is a key move in this line, and once again black is able to strip open lines by taking on e4 and then castling. I presume white plays this way because he can take on f6 here, and well, take away an attacking piece, presumably, from black. But after castles bishop d6, black is getting his attack all the same. Interesting complications follow h3, rook g8. Very interesting idea. If white takes the piece, we go queen h4, queen h2 check, king f2, queen h4 check. And, well, white can't go king g1 in this position because of bishop h2 check. So king e2, rook d e8 is now very interesting, and the position is simply extremely unclear after bishop f5, king b8, bishop e6, and now rook takes g4, with numerous threats from black. to the white position. Now the chances of you getting this at club level are, I would say, minimal, but it is worthwhile, absorbing this variation, because it does give an idea of the tactical interplay of the open game, how important tactics are in the open game, and how difficult it can be for white, or either colour in fact, if they fall behind in development. Now let's come to our featured game, Julio Becerra Rivero versus Malik Set Kachayan, who's graded 2546, where white snaps off the rook. This looks catastrophic initially after knight c3 check, because black is winning white's queen, but white's intention is to play rook e1 and repin the queen. Well, okay, knight takes f2, this has all been seen. Bishop takes h7. Now the knight on h8 can come back from the dead, and Kachayan plays knight e4 check. Not such a bad move, but there's an amazing move here in knight e5, which is actually good for black. So please take the time and trouble to memorise the following lines. It looks as though this is bad. Rook takes e5. What is black going to do against that? Well, it turns out he can play bishop e6. And believe it or not, white can't make capital of the pin on the e file. It really is amazing. For instance, if he goes bishop g8 in this position, which produces one of the weirdest positions known to mankind, black has queen h4 check. Queen h4, excuse me. And what is white to play? Black's threat is queen takes d4. If he goes rook takes e6 check, we go king d7. And suddenly there's a whole bunch of white pieces en prise. The knight's en prise on h8. Bishop b4 check will uncover an attack from the queen's rook against the bishop on g8. Knight e4 check is in the wings. There are just too many white pieces en prise in this position. So knight g6 you could consider natural. Queen takes d4 check, king e2, and now bishop d6 starts to look very good for black, as again after rook takes e6 check, king d7 produces a remarkable position where it's white who has a lot of thinking to do, as most of his pieces are now attacked, and black's attack against the white king is ready to begin. So going back to the position now after knight e5, rook takes e5, bishop e6, bishop g6 check has also been suggested. And after king d7, we now have a further parting of the ways. If white tries bishop f5, we can go queen g5 check. And if king e2, we have queen takes c1. It really is remarkable here that white can't get any attack going here against the black king. But after bishop takes d5 check, Grandmaster Yusupov gives king b6 with advantage to black. Well, winning advantage in fact, because of the weakness of white's entire position really. Going back to the position after king d7, bishop f7 is also a possibility. Well, there we have knight e4 check, king comes to e3, knight g5 holding the fort, believe it or not, and I think that move is winning for black, given that the threat is now knight takes f7. After knight e4 check, if white goes king d3, black has the astonishing move knight c5 check. And if d takes c5, the equally remarkable bishop f5 check. If rook takes f5, queen e4 check, king c3, queen takes f5, bishop e3, and now the further line opening move d4 check. Well, all these complications have obviously got to be looked at and memorised, but I think they do provide a very good answer to this capture on h8. As it was, we have to return to the very unbalanced position in the game, Becerra Rivero versus Kachayan. I think we have to assume that despite the fact that black is 25-46, he didn't know that theory and decided to stick with knight e4. Well, after that, we get an interesting drawing mechanism here. After rook takes e4, bishop g6 check, and now knight f7 check. A natural balance in the position exists here, and nobody is going to break it. So the two players agreed a draw. Now, let's go back to knight d7 one more time and summarise our thoughts on knight takes f7. If black must have a draw, he can take the knight and play his king to e7. That should give him more or less a draw immediately. So actually, this is a rather limp line for white, if we take that into consideration. If black wants to play flat out for the win, he can try queen e7. After that, he's got to memorise the complications after knight takes h8. And don't forget, after bishop takes h7. The next move we're going to look at is another rare guest to the knight d7 tournament table. It's 6 queen e2. This is a trappy move. White intends to win a pawn if black plays knight takes e5, with bishop takes e4, d takes e4, queen takes e4, bishop e6, and now queen takes e5. This pawn sacrifice by black, it's a deliberate sacrifice, has been around for a long time. In these days of computer chess, where there are a lot of strong playing programs designed to refute such a pawn sacrifice, it's risky in my view to carry on with this when black has a safe move back at move 6. Instead of knight takes e5, he can play queen e7. And I've got some improvements over existing theory which I'm going to present to you on this DVD, which I hope will completely solve black's problems. Now, at the outset, we're going to look at the game Timon versus Larsen, Bugogno, 1980, where Timon castled. However, the most critical move here is knight takes d7, and after bishop d7, castles on the king side, castles on the queen side by black, and now c4. Now I would like to suggest the improvement in this position, knight d6. I don't believe this move has been seen much at all before, and it leads to a very good game for black, with the following variations. If white takes on d5, black takes on e2 and plays bishop b5, with a more than comfortable game. Black will get his pawn back, and it's likely that actually both the white d pawns are going to fall. At any rate, they're going to condemn white to a passive defence. Going back to knight takes d7, let's run this line again. Knight d6, our improvement, and now comes queen takes e7. The idea of this is to take on d5 again, but this time we go bishop f6, and after bishop e3 we again play bishop b5, training in on white's weak pawns. I believe this idea of knight d6 renders knight takes d7 ineffectual. Back at queen e7, white may play bishop takes e4, d takes e4. Of course, the difference between this and the other line is that white can't play queen takes e4 anymore because of f6, winning a piece. So if he tries something like, say, bishop f4, we take on e5, and then we develop our bishop to f5. Really, with black in possession of the two bishops, this position should be completely equal, at least for black, and this is confirmed after queen e6, queen e3, and now h5. Of course, once again, the pawn on the e4 is impossible to take because of f6 at the end, pinning the bishop to the queen. So I think actually queen e7 is looking like it gives black a very comfortable game against queen e2. At any rate, Timon castled. Now Larsen liquidated, which is the main idea of this line, and knight c5 was played in peace. Once again, it's another one of those scenarios where black is thinking at every stage about taking the bishop pair away from white by playing knight takes d3. Well, Timon played b3, perhaps with the idea of bishop a3, but Larsen wasn't too concerned about that. He played bishop e6, and the point of this is to answer bishop a3 with just the sensible move queen d7, after which black has no problems. So f4 was played by Timon, trying to get some initiative. Larsen blocked him. Now the bishop came to b2, and castles on the queen side was Larsen's move. Knight d2, king b8, knight f3, and now Larsen played queen d7. We're coming now to the nub of the matter, as Timon plays a3, and black snaps off that light square bishop. C takes d3. Bishop c5 check. Black is confident in his ability to withstand the onslaught from white's knight after bishop d4, bishop takes d4, knight takes d4. Of course, going back to bishop c5 check, white could have played d4, but in that case, black's light square bishop becomes a much stronger piece, and white can't use the d4 square for instance, a knight. If he plays knight d4, he goes into a self-pin. Well, at the very least, black can snap off that knight as and when it becomes necessary to produce an opposite colour bishop's position, which should be completely equal. Just to show you what might happen after knight d4, well, I think actually queen b5 is just a perfectly satisfactory move. And if b4 here, this is the right moment to take, and then bishop f5 with an equal game. So going back to bishop c5 check, Timman played bishop d4. Larsen was right on time with the capture, and then came c5. And once again, we're reaching one of those Petroff situations where you can see how the game goes towards a draw very quickly now, with white playing d4. Black plays c4, an excellent move, just forcing a liquidation. And then there is a capture on d4, leading to a drawn endgame after rook e1. And in this position, the players agreed to a draw. So I think what I'm saying, if we go back to the opening, that queen e2 can be met successfully with queen e7. Black should have no problems in this variation. We are already seeing, I think, that white has quite a few options against knight d7, but that with correct play, black should be able to rebuff most of these unusual moves. The next move I'd like to consider for white is knight c3, again attempting to budge black's knight out of the centre by simultaneously attacking both e4 and c3. In my view, black should carry on with his straightforward plan of getting rid of that pesky white knight on e5 and following up with bishop b4. This is a very reliable counter, perhaps aiming to eliminate the c3 knight with the bishop, maintaining the knight on e4. So the game I'd like to show you now comes from the United Insurance Open, played in the Arab Emirates in 2003, between Rifat bin Sattar and Inamul Hossain. Both of these players are rated in excess of 2450. And white decided to castle, whereupon black went through with his plan, taking on c3 and then bringing the bishop out to e6. Well, white struggles to get the advantage against this sensible plan. And in the game, Rifat decided to play queen e1, protecting his pawn on c3 and attacking the knight on e4. But there are certainly other moves which could be considered. For instance, white may try f4 in this position. And now I quite like f5. Again, reinforcing the knight. It's important for black to keep that knight in the game, and more or less forcing white to capture on f6, after which black's queen comes into the game free of charge. Probably white has nothing better now than to just take on e4 and to go queen h5 check, initiating some sort of drawing mechanism after queen f7, queen b5 check, c6, queen b4, and now bishop d5, when it's hard to see either side making anything of this position. Perhaps black is slightly for choice with his better pawn structure and possible attacking chances on the king side, but white has his fair share of chances too. For instance, he may dissuade black from casting on the queen side with a4, and if black goes b6, a5, c5, queen a4 check, queen d7 is about level. All as in the game Palach versus Arkhipov, Belgrade, 1988. Going back to bishop e6, white has also tried a4 in this position. Black took on c3 in the game Szymanski versus Janic, Krynica, 1994, and after queen e1 he went d4. Basically this is a speculative way of playing by white, and black with his rock solid Petroff structure should be able to hold quite comfortably. In fact, black went on to get the better position here after queen f2, king b8, h3, bishop f5, logically offering the trade of bishops, and now queen d5. Going back once more to the position after bishop e6, c4 has also been tried. Again, trying to get rid of the double pawns and to undermine the support of the knight on e4. Well, there, knight c5 is a good move, And if c takes d5, queen takes d5. Bishop b5 check in the game Oral versus Petroff, Montreal 2001 was answered by c6. Queen takes d5, bishop takes d5, bishop e2, castles on the queen side when black should be in no danger. The game continued, bishop e3, which looks good at first sight, b6, bishop takes c5, b takes c5, f4, and now king c7. And black has counterplay in view of his idea of rook b8 and then rook b2. So going back, I think what I'm saying is that it's unlikely in this variation, given the fact that two pairs of minor pieces have been exchanged, that white can budge the solidity of black's position by such means. After queen e1 in the game, black played knight c5. Rifat played bishop b5 check, and black played c6. And now white tried the tricky move, bishop a3. Well, in such situations, black should rely on the solidity of his position, and Hossein retreated with knight d7. And white was evidently hoping that after bishop d3, his bishop on a3 would become very strong. But black moved to restrain that bishop by playing c5. Now black has ideas, certainly, of queen out to a5. White went f4. Well, this is a common idea in the knight c3 line, and black should put the block on that pawn by playing g6. c4. Yes, nice idea. And the point of it is that after d takes c4, white's going bishop e4. Such active measures with the black king stuck in the middle are quite appropriate. So that's why after queen c4, black decided to play queen c7. c takes d5, bishop takes d5, c4, and now bishop back to e6. Not bishop c6 in this position, when I think white would have a lot of fun after pushing his pawn up to e6. So white continues to bring his pieces onto open lines, and black castles confident in the stability of his structure. Bishop e4 more or less forces b6, bishop d5 was played. Rook h e8, queen c3, g5, chipping away at the white pawn chain, and white played bishop b2. G takes f4, rook f e8. Well, there were slight problems for white in this position with the e5 pawn, so that's why white went rook f e1. Black redirected his knight around to g6, which was a much better square, both protecting f4, attacking e5, and not interrupting the natural flow of his rooks. And after a4, black went a5. I think it's only a question of black having the advantage in this position if he defends sensibly. Queen b3 was played, and black brought his king to a safe square on a7, intending to answer rook b1 with rook b8. Of course, white's initiative in this position has to be respected. Black must defend with care, but well, after queen d1, rook e d8, it's hard to see a way through for white, and he mustn't forget that he's a pawn down in this position. Well, queen f3 was played. I mean, maybe white should just settle for rook b2 in this position and swing the rook across to d2. Of course, after rook b d8, black is still defending, and is a little bit better, I would say. But queen f3 in the game allows queen d7, and as the bishop on d5 is the only piece keeping white's position together, then I think you can safely say queen d7 undermines the influence of that piece. Rook e d1, bishop g4, ouch. Queen f2. Well, now of course, once the exchange goes west, white is certainly relying on the bishop on d5 to keep him in the game. But black now steers the game to victory very confidently. He plays f3. Very good. Bishop takes f3, queen takes c4. So white took with the queen. The queens came off in a flash, and black played rook d7. Rook e4. And now maybe the simplest way was just to protect the pawn in order to play knight e7 and get rid of that pesky bishop. Instead, in the game, Hossein played knight e7, bishop takes f7, and the idea was to move the rook into d3. Bishop e1 was played, rook takes f3. and now white played bishop d5. Move 40, and rook e8 was played. Bishop g3, knight takes d5, c takes d5, and now possibly the move white had overlooked, rook d3. And the cute tactical point behind this move is that if white plays d6, black is going to take it off, winning straight away. So rook h4 was played, rook takes d5, rook takes h7 check, king a6, and in this position white decided to resign. A very respectful move, a very respectful decision, but the fact is black is threatening just to gobble the pawn on a4 with a move like rook d4, and white's e-pawn is easy to contain. So summarising, going back to knight c3, I think this move can be met successfully with knight takes e5 and then bishop b4. It really is as simple as that. The main line, undoubtedly, in this variation occurs after knight takes e4, bishop d3, d5, knight takes e5, knight d7, and now knight takes d7, bishop takes d7, and white castles. The point of this move is to really introduce an element of simplicity into the position, in that white wants to play c4 and just undermine the knight on e4 without any tears. However, the ensuing play is far from simple, as we will see. Black has many different options here, but I'm going to recommend the straightforward move, bishop d6. A move which may lead to a kingside attack, is as natural a developing move as is possible to play in the position, and may involve a pawn sacrifice. Well, black has ideas certainly of queen h4 immediately. We now come to the game Kamsky versus Karpov, played in Elista in 1996 in their FIDE World Championship match, where white played knight c3. Then came queen h4. Well, just going back one move, obviously black could take on c3 here, and if b takes c3, well, we reach a position where after queen h4, rook e1 check, an element of unclear play is apparent in the position. I think black is okay after king f8. He can also play bishop e6 in this position. Going back to knight takes c3, b takes c3. There's also queen f6 to be considered. I guess this is a slightly more stable way of playing with black, and if rook e1 check, just bishop e6. So if queen h5, attacking the pawn on d5 and threatening bishop g5, h6 is interesting. And if queen takes d5, black can castle, with compensation in view of the idea of bishop c6. But going back to Karpov-Kamsky, let's stick with queen h4 for the time being. And the first point of this move to note is that h3 can be answered by bishop takes h3, which is pretty crushing. So Kamsky played g3. Now black took on c3 and white recaptured. Obviously, if white plays queen e1 check in this position, black has queen e7, and if queen takes c3, black just castles with equality. So knight takes c3, b takes c3 was played, and black played queen g4. Rook e1 check, king d8. Now you wouldn't normally see Karpov playing this move, but it's a move which is born out of excellent judgment. Black recognises that his king is relatively secure in the centre of the board, because, well, you know, how can white attack it? The queens are perhaps coming off in this position, and after that the king in the middle might be well placed for any upcoming late middle game stroke end game. White's got to remember in this position his pawn structure is worse. He can't just go hell for leather against the black king. King f8 was also possible. But let's just see what happened now after king d8. Bishop e2. Well, Kamsky recognises that exchanging the queens here wouldn't really lead to very much. Let's just see what happens. Queen takes g4, bishop takes d4, rook b1, b6, and this endgame certainly doesn't look better for white. So Kamsky keeps the pieces on with bishop e2, queen f5, and white plays rook b1. Alright, b6, and now Kamsky tries to open the game with c4. Alright, d takes c4, bishop takes c4, rook e8. Common sense chess. And now white played bishop e3. So Kamsky's used this pawn break, c4, just to open things up. And his plan now would be to retreat the bishop to f1 and then just to continue trying to lever open the position by pushing his c-pawn up the board. Bishop c6. Black has to play very accurately to counter this plan. And certainly Karpov is now thinking about moves such as queen f3 or queen e4 at the right moment. d5. Well, of course, that takes the sting out of a later c4, c5. So I would say, despite the fact that white looks as though he's gained a move here, it's not really a move white wants to play just yet. Perhaps d5 has been forced a little early from Kamsky's point of view. Bishop f1. h6. Typical Karpov safety move, keeping white pieces out of g5. White goes through with c4, rook e7, bishop d3, queen f6, and now king g2 was played by Kamsky. Well, what else? I mean, he could have tried bishop f1 here, just intending bishop g2. I think after that, black would do best to run his king to f8. And now we see, with rook a e8 to come, that black has regrouped successfully. Going back to queen f6, well, maybe queen c2 was a move, as suggested by Grandmaster Lubomir Fatachnik. And the idea of that is to try to break through with c5. Well, I think black is okay after some trades. And then queen d6. If queen takes a7 in this position, rook takes a7, and now rook b8 check. We have bishop c8, rook takes c8 check, king d7, bishop f5 check, rook e6. Remarkable complications. D takes e6, and now king e7. And after e takes f7, king takes f7, black has not only survived the attack, he is, for the time being, material ahead. So, the players have plenty to think about. After king g2, king e8 was played by Karpov. It's a regrouping, intending king f8, perhaps king g8, and rook a e8, certainly. So bishop c2 was played, queen c3, bishop b3, and black got on with the job. King f8, rook c1, queen f6, bishop c2, and then the nice move, rook a e8. So Karpov really at his best over the last few moves. Karpov's ability to coordinate his pieces, make them efficient, make them active, is really wonderful to watch. Queen d3. Bishop g4. Well, white had certainly been limbering up to play queen h7, but the problem with queen h7 now is that g5 is excellent. What is the queen doing on h7 in this position? And black is suddenly much better. White's got to be careful of his own king, and there's really no attack to be seen for white here. So Kamsky decides to play bishop d2. This is a mistake, of course, perhaps prompted by time trouble. What should he play? Well, probably he should just go f4 in this position. And perhaps then simplest for black is bishop f5. I mean, there's a set of trades here. And after rook takes e3, of course, black is okay here. But the position tends towards a draw. Instead, bishop d2 was played. But rook e2 is now a very strong move. Rook takes e2, rook takes e2. Well, serious pressure is being mounted on f2. Rook f1. Rook takes d2. Ouch. Kamsky resigns. Why? because if he goes queen takes d2, we have the simple queen f3 check and then bishop h3. What is white to play here? The only move's bishop e4. Well, then we just take it. If f3 in this position, bishop c5 check, king h1, queen f5. The rook is now on pre, g4, queen f6. And that's that. The rook on f1, well, is attacked, can't move anywhere because queen takes f3 is finishing. So an interesting introduction to the main line, and wonderful play by Karpov. It's the Moscow Aeroflot Open now in 2005. Playing white is Damon Sadvasakov, graded 2635. Playing black, Alberto David, 2573. White takes on d7, castles, and after bishop d6, he plays the critical c4. This, you could safely say, is the main point of white's whole variation, and black has to be careful against it, and he has to be willing to sacrifice a pawn. Black should definitely play c6, and in this game, Sadvakasov took on d5, and then played knight c3. So no expenses spared to budge that knight from e4. Well, David took on c3, and then castled. And the pawn sacrifice comes immediately into play after queen h5, g6, queen takes d5. So what compensation could black possibly have for a pawn in this position? Well, let's take play on a little bit further, queen c7. And we immediately see here that black is attacking two pawns. Now that's the first thing. So I think if white plays neutrally here, then black is just going to regain his pawn without tears. However, white has a number of alternatives here which have to be respected. Now in the game, white decided to play c4. If he goes queen f3, probably the best move for black is queen takes c3. And if bishop h6, just rook fe8. Queen f6 can be answered by bishop f8. And after bishop takes f8, rook takes f8, black's position is pretty stable. In fact, this variation tends towards equality, as after bishop e4, black may play bishop c6, and then rook fc1 was already agreed drawn in the game Dochev versus Konopka, Pardubice 2000. Going back to the position after queen c7, well, queen f3, queen takes c3, bishop h6 we've already seen the consequences of. Queen f6 is another move. Perhaps this should be answered by queen c6. And if bishop g5 in this position, bishop c7 is safe, offering the exchange of queens. After bishop e4, we go queen takes f6, bishop takes f6, and now rook a b8, with equality. So going back to queen c7 one more time, and noting now that there are two white pawns on pre, white may also try, in this position, bishop h6. Well, after that, I think rook fe8, and black is okay. Going back one more time to the position after queen c7, white could also try bishop d2, as in the game Antonio versus Handoko, Singapore 1995. Well, there, bishop takes h2 check, and then bishop c6 is very reasonable for black. Going back again, white's also played h3 in this position. You can see there are a lot of moves, but after that, I think bishop e6 is again very reasonable for black. So let's go back now to Sadvasakov. I have difficulties pronouncing his name. David, and the move c4. Well, black played bishop e6 in the game. He could obviously have taken on h2. That's another variation, and retreated his bishop to d6. But white's idea against that is to play c5 and thereby gain some time. Not sure how much better white is in this position, but certainly black has to be careful on the long diagonal after moves like d5. Perhaps black should steer clear of that variation. And after bishop e6, queen f3, David took on c4. Now white's point was that he was going to play bishop h6 here. Now bishop takes c4, queen takes c4, queen f6 was played in the game Hanley versus Guaza, Halifax 2003. But queen e6 defends for black. Obviously the queens can be exchanged, and after rook b1, b6, it's about level. No problems for black. So bishop h6 by Sadvakasov. Rook fe8. Not bishop takes d3 note, due to queen f6. But rook fe8. Rook fc1. And now b5. g3. Giving the king a bit of air. Rook ad8. Sensible centralisation. Rook ab1. There was a game of Anand versus Ivanchuk where a4 and then a6 were interjected. This game was drawn shortly. Rook ab1 was played in the game, and black played bishop f8. Bishop takes c4. Bishop takes h6. Bishop takes b5. Oh dear. Well, white made a mistake. I mean, what he should play is Kramnik's recommendation here. Rook c3. Intending to answer rook takes d4 with bishop takes b5. Instead, bishop takes b5 allows bishop takes c1. Bishop takes e8, rook takes e8. And suddenly, white finds to his consternation that his idea of rook b7 is met by queen c4. And black retains his extra piece. So that was a fairly catastrophic finish for white. It need not always go like that for white. But I think black is hanging on, and maybe more than that, in the knight c3 line. Just to show you how drastically wrong things can go for white in this variation, we now come to the game Lautier versus Gelfand, played in the FIDE World Championship Knockout Tournament in 1999, where white found another way of accepting the pawn sacrifice by black, playing c4, black goes c6, white takes on d5, and then moves in with the immediate queen h5. After which it's best for black to sacrifice a pawn with castles. Now knight c3 may be answered with g6, and a position similar to the main line will occur after queen takes d5, bishop c6. In the game Lautier-Gelfand, white took on d5 straight away, and after bishop c6 went back queen h5. Now black must play g6, repelling borders. And after queen h3, knight g5 was played. Well, Lautier didn't want to surrender the bishop pair so easily, so he played queen g4. But bishop takes g5 was the precise move played in Luther versus Alterman, Bundesliga, 1998. After queen takes g5, knight c3, rook a e8, black has evident compensation for his pawn. Two excellent bishops. White's pawn is isolated, but it is of course extra. Rook a d1 was played, and black just coordinated his pieces here by playing rook e7, and in the game knight e4 was answered by rook takes e4, queen takes d7, rook d8, best move, queen takes d8, queen takes d8, bishop takes e4, queen f6, and this position is roughly balanced. The game was drawn after g3, queen takes b2, rook b1, queen d4, bishop f3, b6, rook bc1, and now bishop c5. Draw agreed. So, in the game Lautier-Gelfand, white played queen to g4. Knight comes back to e6. Threatening knight takes d4, followed by bishop takes h2 check. White protected against this with bishop e3. Well, he can go bishop at h6 straight away. But after rook e8, knight c3, black has the interesting move bishop f4 here. If bishop takes f4, we go queen takes d4. That's the point. Hitting two white bishops, obviously. So, going back, bishop e3 was played, and now Gelfand played h5. After queen h3, bishop d7. made life for white's queen uncomfortable. Queen went to f3, bishop c6, and now white should certainly play queen h3 with equality. As it turned out, Lautier got a bit too overambitious here after queen d1. And after queen h4, suddenly he found himself in a spot of bother. This is where the move h5 comes in very useful, as in the variation after g3, queen h3, f3, well, what else? Black has h4, prizing open the white kingside decisively. So after queen h4, h3 was played, but now came knight g5, and again, white is in more than a spot of bother here. If he takes on g5, queen takes g5, threatens mate on g2. If then g3, black just strips white open with bishop takes g3. If f3, queen e3 check, very embarrassing, rook f2 is answered by bishop g3, and king h1 is answered by queen f4. White's kingside is a mass of holes. So in the game, there came d5. Knight takes h3 check, ouch. Queen takes h3, threatening mate. And what is white to do about it? Not a lot. This position reminds me of the Marshall Gambit in the Ruy Lopez, where white has gone drastically wrong. Well, bishop h2 check, king h1, bishop takes d5 check. You can see what's going to happen now. f3, bishop f4 check. I mean, maybe there was even better here in bishop g3 check, queen h2 check, queen h1 check. Well, what else? And now bishop takes f3. That was also winning. But the game is fairly conclusive as well. Bishop f4 check was played, king g1, and now just bishop takes f3 with a decisive fork on the queen and mate at g2. That was that. So that's a good example of how quickly the black initiative can be brought to bear against white's king. My conclusion, going back to c4, is that black, certainly at an average level of play, will get very good chances with the pawn sacrifice after c6. Remember the castle, and if you need to play g6, by all means do so. The point is that after queen takes d5, you're going to get tremendously active bishops with bishop c6. You should embrace this variation. I think it will score well for you. Summarising, I think knight d7 is a good way to meet this variation as black. The positional point is to get rid of the strong knight on e5, and all variations seem to be holding up for black in this year of 2009. You may employ this variation with confidence. To finish off then, what else does white have after knight f6? Well, he's certainly got knight c3, angling to go back into the four knights. I believe that black should not play ball in this position, and that bishop b4 is a respectable way to meet this quiet variation. We now come to the game Nisipianu versus Daniel Friedman. Both of these players are graded 2660 plus, and this game was played in the Romanian Team Championship in September 2009. White decided to take the pawn on e5, but black's idea is to castle in this position. It's very risky for white to keep the pawn in this position, and indeed there doesn't appear to be any way to do so constructively, given that black has ideas of, for instance, regaining the pawn with simple moves such as queen e7 or rook e8, and then opening up the game with d5. So Nisipianu employed the book recommendation here of knight d3. This obliges white to black to surrender the bishop pair, but in return he messes up the white queenside pawns, as we've seen so often in the Petroff, and gets to recapture the pawn on e4. Yes, white has two bishops in this line, but the counterbalancing feature is the pawn structure. So I think black is okay here. Bishop e2 was played, very quiet play by white, and Friedman just centralised his pieces. So common sense play is the order of the day for black in this line. Basically black's plan is something like bishop out to f5, and then the knight from b8 to d7, and then either up to c5 or across to f6. That will be black's upcoming development plan. So white tries to interrupt this by playing f3. Knight comes back to f6, bishop g5. But it's hard to see white maintaining an advantage by these means. Well, because he's weakened his e3 square. Black continued to play in rock solid fashion with knight bd7, knight f2, queen e7, and now came g5, and then knight h5. So in this line, white is not even able to retain the advantage of the two bishops. Queen d2, knight e5, bishop b5, and probably white doesn't want to play black doesn't want to play c6 in this position and weaken d6. So he settled for rook f8. Rook a d1 was played, knight takes g3, and now queen f6. Queen d4, queen g7, rook e3. Nisipianu offers draw. Friedman accepts. Our first encounter with this reliable line as black. My final game comes from the Serbian Team Championship First League, played in September 2009, between Emil Sutovsky and Konstantin Sakayev, both 2600 plus grandmasters. And after knight c3, black went bishop b4. Once again, white played knight takes e5. We've seen that a creative grandmaster such as Sutovsky has problems against the Petroff, and to see him playing knight c3 is a sad sight indeed. Now white has bishop c4 in this position, and after castles, maybe knight takes e5. Black has to know what to do against this variation. Well, queen e7 is a sensible and reliable choice. When the knight moves from e5, as it must if white plays d4, black has knight takes e4, then black can regain his pawn quite comfortably by taking on c3 and taking on e4. We reach a slight imbalance after queen e2, bishop takes e2. Which feature of the position is more important, white's bishop pair or, black's better pawn structure? I think the position tends towards equality. Black can play d6, he puts his knight in on e4. He's not troubled in any way in the opening and can centralise his pieces along the lines of the coming game. So, Sutovsky played knight takes e5, and a similar position is reached after castles, bishop e2, rook e8, knight d3, and now black gets his pawn back. So something similar to the earlier example. Knight f4, d6, and common sense chess by black, just getting his pieces out here. h6. Well, I think white should just settle for bishop e3 in this position, with rough equality. In the game, he plays a5, a move typical of Sutovsky's ambitious style, but Sakayev now plays a very good move here, a6, fixing that pawn, and in fact it's the a5 pawn that gives white problems as the game progresses. Well, he can't hold it actually. I think Sutovsky should simply settle for bishop e3. Instead, white presses, keeps pressing. He wants to move his rook to a3 and then across to g3. And this is the second moment in the game where white is overambitious. He's pushed that pawn to a5. It's a target for the black pieces. Now white should simply accept that black has completely equalised and just take the draw after rook g3. Instead, Sutovsky plays on for the win after rook takes e8 check, and this leads him into trouble because, well, as you can see, there's nothing wrong with black's position. It's rock solid. He's got all his pieces out. He's got pressure against the pawn at a5. It's obvious to the naked eye that black is in good shape. But white plays on for the win and suffers as a result. I don't know what Sutovsky thought he was doing here, whether he was going to get any discoveries here with the bishop on e2. But black's next move is very good. Queen e4. Black counters by attacking c2. Excellent stuff. And by so doing, keeps the better game. Bishop d2 was played. Queen takes d5. Turns out Sakayev has calculated this very well and steers a steady course round any tactics and keeps his extra material. White's obviously got two bishops pointing at black's king, but well, black has two extra pawns in this position and they should be enough to hold the day. So over the subsequent course of the game, what we see is a long grind where white never really gets any serious chances. Instead, black uses his technique and expertise to steer the game to victory. He's even willing to give a pawn back in this position to just take away one of white's bishops. Of course, white can't really oblige by taking the pawn back. He knows that he just end up a pawn down for nothing. So we get this steady route by black to victory. He finds the best way to open the game. Queen c5 check. Bishop f5. Just safety first, really. Queen d1. D takes c2. And white is lost in this position. He really is. There's nothing he can do. Just got to create as crazy a position as he possibly can. That's why the king's on h4. And hope that black goes wrong. It doesn't come to pass. Black is safe all the way through this game. And now comes the excellent a4. Again, a liquidation procedure where black retains his extra material. As I said, it's a long, slow process, but entirely manageable by black. Okay, Queen e7 was played, Rook e1, Rook d4, counter pin, King h7, Queen f3, Queen d6. Eventually black's going to get those queenside pawns going. Queen g3. Well, of course, black could trade the queens here. Instead he plays for more, pinning the bishop again. Queen c7. Swiatkowski's getting desperate. Rook e3. That's a really desperate move, playing for stalemate. But after rook f4, black is having none of it. So a long game, but a game which reinforces the reliability, going back to the opening, of bishop b4. This is the 3 knights, and it's a very respectable way to play for black. I think you can employ this variation with confidence. This brings us to the end of our DVD on the Petroff, which I hope you've enjoyed. We've seen that black is holding his own in this year of 2009 in this variation, and that I think the Petroff is due for a renaissance at lower levels of chess. It's always been popular among the Grandmaster elite, but you can